Because of his silver-tongued mistress, my husband beat me mercilessly. I immediately called my billionaire father and told him to do exactly what he warned me about and destroy his life. 10 minutes later, he was completely stunned and fell apart. I am Cassidy, 27 years old, and until last night, I played the role of a struggling freelance art restorer just to see if the man I loved actually loved me back. Instead of love, I got a split lip and a cheating husband who thought my bank account was as empty as his promises. When he threw me out of our luxury Chicago apartment, he had no idea he was evicting the sole heiress to a multi-billion-dollar global investment firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who drastically underestimated your worth. The sharp, echoing crack of an open hand striking my face bounced off the high ceilings of our luxury Chicago apartment. The force of the blow sent me crashing to the cold hardwood floor. A sharp metallic tang flooded my mouth as my teeth cut into my lower lip, sending a warm trickle of blood down my chin. I stayed on the floor for a second, the room spinning slightly, trying to process the physical shock of what my husband of 2 years had just done to me. On the white leather sofa just a few feet away sat Sienna. She was 25, Derek's executive assistant, and apparently his mistress. She was clutching her chest, forcing fake tears to stream down her perfectly contoured face. But my eyes were not on her fake tears. My eyes were fixed on her neck. Resting against her collarbone was a vintage emerald necklace. It was not just any jewelry. It was a sacred heirloom that had belonged to my late mother, a piece I kept safely hidden away in my private lockbox. I did not mean to start a fight, Sienna sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. I just wanted to try it on because it looked so pretty. I asked her nicely, but she attacked me. I was just trying to defend myself. She had not asked. I had walked into my own home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the restoration studio to find her digging through my personal safe, trying on my mother's necklace while wearing my husband's dress shirt. When I demanded she take it off, Derek had walked out of the master bathroom and immediately sided with the woman invading my home. Derek stepped over me, his dress shoes stopping inches from my face. He grabbed my packed suitcase, the one I had just brought back from an art appraisal trip, and kicked it violently toward the front door. The heavy bag slammed against the entryway wall, snapping the handle. "Who the hell are you to yell at her?" Derek roared, his face twisted in a mask of arrogant rage. "You are a broke college dropout scraping paint off old canvases. If I did not marry you and pay the rent, you would be starving in that pathetic art studio of yours. You contribute absolutely nothing to this household. Get out of my house." I slowly pushed myself up onto my knees, tasting the blood pooling in the corner of my mouth. His words were designed to break me, to remind me of the power dynamic he thought he controlled. For 2 years, I had maintained the illusion that my freelance art restoration business barely made ends meet. I let him pay the rent on this apartment. I let him buy the groceries. I let him play the role of the successful mid-level tech executive, providing for his struggling artist wife. I did it because I grew up surrounded by people who only loved my family for our wealth. I wanted a marriage based on true partnership, built from the ground up. I wanted to know that if I had nothing, the man I chose would still choose me. Instead, my modesty had fed his narcissism. He truly believed he had rescued me from the gutter. He used his slightly higher income as a weapon to control every aspect of my life, demanding gratitude for basic necessities while treating me like a charity case he had taken pity on. "Look at you," Derek sneered, pointing a finger at my paint-stained jeans and worn-out sweater. "You are a complete embarrassment." Sienna is right. You are violent, ungrateful, and completely useless. I am the vice president of a rising tech company, and I have to come home to a wife who smells like turpentine and acts like a rabid dog when someone simply touches a piece of old, outdated jewelry. Get out of my house right now. Sienna sniffled softly from the couch, burying her face in her hands to hide the victorious smirk I could clearly see forming on her lips. She reached up and touched the emeralds, running her fingers over the stones, as if claiming them as her own. I did not cry. The tears that might have fallen a year ago when I still believed Derek was capable of change were completely dried up. A strange glacial calm washed over me, freezing the panic and hurt into something solid and unbreakable. I wiped the blood from my mouth with the back of my hand, feeling the sting of the cut, but ignoring the pain. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his. I did not scream, I did not throw things. I did not beg him to remember our wedding vows or the life we had planned to build. I simply looked at the man I had married, seeing him not as my husband, but as a parasite who had finally exposed his true nature. The arrogance radiating from him was almost comical, considering he had no idea that his entire existence, his career, his apartment, his fabricated sense of superiority rested in the palm of my hand. "You want me to leave," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any emotion. "I want you out of my sight," Derek spat, crossing his arms over his chest. "Take your garbage and do not come back. I will have my lawyer send you the divorce papers. Do not even think about asking for alimony. You get nothing." I nodded slowly. I did not look at Sienna again. I did not ask for the necklace back. I knew exactly where it was, and exactly how I would retrieve it. I walked to the entryway, picked up my broken suitcase, and stepped out the door. I did not look back, as Derek slammed the heavy wooden door behind me, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. I stood in the corridor for a moment, the silence wrapping around me. The charade was over. The struggling artist persona was dead. It was time to introduce my husband to the sole heiress of Vanguard Holdings. Section 2. 1,000 words. Standing in the freezing hallway of the apartment building, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were perfectly steady. The trembling I had felt during the initial shock was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating precision. I scrolled past the contacts for my restoration clients and the local suppliers I had used for years. I bypassed everything connected to the modest life I had built here in Chicago. Instead, I opened an encrypted application I had not used since the day I moved out of my family estate. I dialed a direct, secure line that bypassed all corporate receptionists and gatekeepers. The line rang only once before a deep, commanding voice answered. "Yes," my father said. He did not need to ask who was calling. "Dad," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "Activate Protocol 0. I am done playing the struggling wife." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a pen dropping onto a mahogany desk. When my father spoke again, his voice was terrifyingly calm, carrying the weight of a man who controlled billions of dollars in global assets. "Are you hurt, Cassidy?" he asked. "He hit me," I replied simply. "I have a split lip, and he threw me out of the apartment." Sienna, his assistant, is currently sitting on his couch wearing Mom's vintage emerald necklace. The silence that followed was heavier this time. "Jonathan, my father was a ruthless billionaire on the trading floor, a man feared by corporate raiders and prime ministers alike. But when it came to his family, his protectiveness bordered on lethal. He had warned me about Derek from the very beginning. When I first introduced them, Derek had spent the entire dinner bragging about his minor promotions and talking over me, desperate to impress a man he thought was just a retired accountant. My father had seen right through the facade. He told me Derek was a narcissist who thrived on feeling superior, a man who would inevitably punish me for any success I achieved. But I had been stubborn. I wanted to prove that I could find a partner who loved me for my mind and my passion, not for the Vanguard Holdings trust fund attached to my name. I wanted to build a life completely separate from the crushing expectations of the corporate dynasty. My father had respected my wishes, allowing me to move to Chicago and set up my modest art restoration studio. He promised not to interfere, but he had insisted on establishing Protocol 0, a contingency plan, ready to deploy the second I realized he was right. "I should have listened to you," I admitted, leaning my back against the cool wall of the hallway. "You saw exactly who he was." "Do not apologize for having a good heart, Cassidy," my father said, his tone softening for just a fraction of a second before hardening into pure business. "You tried to see the good in a peasant's soul, but a rat only knows how to steal. Now we handle this the Vanguard way. Where are you right now?" "I am standing outside the apartment," I said. "I have my suitcase." "A black car is already being dispatched to your location," my father instructed. "Go down to the lobby and wait. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer any calls from him. I am calling Kendra immediately. Your brilliant African-American sister-in-law is the best corporate attorney in the country. She will handle the legal extraction. As for your husband and his little startup company, give me 10 minutes. I will make sure his company does not exist by lunch. Thank you, Dad, I said, feeling the immense power of my true family rallying behind me. He touched your mother's necklace, my father added, his voice dropping an octave. He put his hands on my daughter, and he let his mistress wear my late wife's jewelry. Destroying his company is just the appetizer, Cassidy. We are going to erase his entire reality. I will see you soon. The call ended. I lowered the phone, taking a deep breath. The scent of stale hallway air filled my lungs, but it tasted like freedom. For 2 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into Derek's narrow definition of a good wife. I had celebrated his mediocre achievements while downplaying my own intelligence. I had let him lecture me about finances, nodding along while he explained basic economic principles to a woman who had been reading corporate acquisition reports since she was 12 years old. I had done it all in the name of love, believing that my humility would be rewarded with loyalty. Instead, my humility had been rewarded with a slap across the face and a front-row seat to his infidelity. He wanted to be the powerful provider. He wanted to be the untouchable executive lording his wealth over his dependents. Now he was about to learn what real wealth and real power actually looked like. I picked up my broken suitcase and walked toward the elevator. As I pressed the call button, the heavy doors slid open. I stepped inside the mirrored cab, catching a glimpse of my reflection. The blood on my lip had dried into a dark crust. My clothes were wrinkled from travel and stained with old oil paints. I looked exactly like the broke, helpless artist Derek thought I was. But the fire in my eyes belonged to a CEO. I had spent years hiding my true capabilities, pretending to struggle with basic business concepts just to stroke his fragile ego. I had let him believe he was the mastermind of our household, the brilliant strategist who kept a roof over our heads. Every time he mocked my art restoration business, I had swallowed the urge to tell him that my personal investment portfolio generated more profit in a single day than his entire company made in a year. The disguise was suffocating, and stepping out of it felt like taking my first real breath in years. Just as the elevator doors began to close, a muffled sound echoed through the hallway. It was Derek's ringtone blaring loudly from inside the apartment. It rang once, stopped, and immediately started ringing again. The frantic, continuous tone of an emergency call. The financial guillotine had already dropped. I smiled as the elevator doors slid shut, sealing me inside as I began my descent. The dominoes were officially falling. Section 3. 1,000 words. When I reached the sprawling marble lobby of our building, I bypassed the concierge desk and walked straight toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows facing the street. Outside, the Chicago wind was howling, whipping the coats of pedestrians rushing past. I stood quietly with my broken suitcase, waiting for the extraction team my father had promised. While I waited in the serene quiet of the lobby, absolute chaos was erupting exactly 42 floors above my head. Inside our apartment, Derek snatched his phone from the kitchen counter, annoyed by the persistent ringing. He had been in the middle of pouring 2 glasses of champagne to celebrate his newly acquired freedom when the screen flashed with the name of his CEO, Gregory. Derek cleared his throat, adjusting his posture even though he was alone in the kitchen, and answered with his signature overconfident drawl. "Gregory, good morning," Derek said smoothly. "I am just reviewing the quarterly projections before I head into the office. I think we are positioned for a massive breakout this week." "Shut up and listen to me," Gregory screamed through the speaker, his voice shrill with raw panic. "What the hell did you do? Who did you piss off?" Derek blinked, the champagne bottle hovering over the crystal flutes. "What are you talking about?" "Everything is fine. I just finalized the marketing push yesterday." "Nothing is fine," Gregory roared, the sound of frantic typing and shouting echoing in the background of the call. 10 minutes ago, an anonymous offshore entity executed a massive coordinated withdrawal of our primary venture capital funding. They pulled everything, Derek. Every single dime of our Series C funding just evaporated into thin air. Our stock is in a freefall. We are down 40% and dropping by the second. Derek's face went completely pale. He set the bottle down so hard it chipped the granite countertop. "That is impossible," he stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. The funding was locked in, the escrow accounts were secured. They cannot just withdraw capital without a board vote and a 30-day notice period. They did not just withdraw it, you idiot. They bypassed the escrow entirely. Gregory shouted, his voice cracking. The bank just called me. The main operating accounts have been completely frozen pending an immediate federal audit. Some major shareholder initiated a hostile block and triggered an investigation into our financial discrepancies. We cannot make payroll tomorrow. We cannot pay our server hosting fees. The entire company is functionally bankrupt as of 5 minutes ago. Derek gripped the edge of the counter, his mind spinning wildly. This was his entire life's work. He had tied his entire identity, his personal loans, and his future stock options to this startup. If the company went under, he was personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in leveraged debt. He had borrowed against his unvested shares to afford his luxury car and his expensive dinners with Sienna. I will fix this, Derek said desperately, sweat beading on his forehead. I have contacts at the bank. I can call the investment group and smooth things over. Just tell me who initiated the block. We do not know, Gregory yelled. It came from a parent company heavily layered in blind trusts. But the notice explicitly flagged your department. The auditors are demanding your specific division's expense reports. You need to get your ass into this office right now, Derek. If this audit finds a single cent out of place, I am offering you up to the feds on a silver platter. Get here now. The line went dead. Derek stared at his phone, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He leaned against the counter, trying to stop his hands from shaking. This had to be a mistake. A massive, catastrophic computer error. There was no way a multi-million-dollar tech startup could just collapse in the span of 10 minutes. From the living room, a frustrated sigh broke his panicked thoughts. Sienna was sitting on the white leather sofa, her long legs crossed, tapping her manicured nails against her phone screen. The emerald necklace still rested against her skin, a sparkling contrast to her growing irritation. Derek, your stupid card is not working, Sienna whined, tossing her hair over her shoulder. I am trying to order that limited edition designer handbag we looked at last week. You promised I could buy it as a reward for finally getting rid of your miserable wife. But the site keeps saying the transaction is declined. Derek swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. Just try it again, he called out, his voice wavering slightly. It is probably just a network glitch. The banking servers have been acting up all morning. I tried it 3 times. Sienna snapped, standing up and walking into the kitchen. She waved her phone in his face. It is not a glitch. The bank sent an automated alert. Your supplementary credit line has been suspended. Did you forget to pay the bill again? You know how much I hate being embarrassed like this. I cannot even buy a simple $5,000 bag without your accounts freezing. Derek snatched the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the banking alert. It was true. The corporate credit card he used for his personal expenses, the same card tied to the company accounts that were just frozen, was completely dead. He had 0 cash flow. His personal checking account was linked to the same institution, which meant his entire financial existence was currently locked in a vault he could not access. Fix it, Sienna demanded, crossing her arms and pouting. I earned that bag for putting up with your wife screaming today. Derek stared at the error message on the screen. The panic inside his chest twisted instantly into a familiar toxic rage. He could not yell at his CEO. He could not yell at the bank. So he directed his fury at the only target he thought was beneath him. This is her fault, he muttered, his jaw clenching. Whose fault? Sienna asked, confused. Cassidy? Derek spat, tossing the phone onto the counter. She probably called the credit card company and reported the card stolen just to be vindictive because I threw her out. She is trying to sabotage me because she knows she is entirely dependent on my money. She thinks she can freeze my accounts to force me to take her back. Sienna rolled her eyes. That is so pathetic. What are you going to do? Derek straightened his collar, his arrogance returning to mask his terror. I am going to the office to clear up this company misunderstanding. Then I am going to have my lawyers draft a divorce agreement that leaves her absolutely destitute. She wants to play games with my money. I will make sure she spends the rest of her life paying off my debts. She is a broke, pathetic amateur, and I am going to crush her. Derek grabbed his keys and his designer coat, practically sprinting toward the front door. He did not bother to check on Sienna or assure her that everything would be fine. His mind was entirely consumed by the desperate need to save his own reputation. As he rushed into the hallway, leaving the apartment behind, he completely failed to realize that the life he was running back to no longer existed. The financial trap had already closed around his neck, and every step he took forward was just pulling the noose tighter. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality of his situation, leaving him totally defenseless against the storm that was about to hit. My name is Cassidy, and standing in the freezing hallway of the luxury apartment building, I pressed my hand against the cold painted wall to steady myself. The stinging pain radiating from my split lip was a sharp physical reminder of the illusion I had just allowed to shatter. For 2 years, I had shrunk myself to fit inside Derek's narrow, suffocating definition of a grateful wife. I had dressed in worn-out sweaters, feigned anxiety over utility bills, and pretended my freelance art restoration business barely generated enough revenue to cover my own modest expenses. I had done it all willingly. I had actively chosen to hide my identity as the sole heiress to Vanguard Holdings, because I desperately wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for who I was, rather than for the multi-billion-dollar trust fund attached to my last name. I reached into the pocket of my paint-stained jeans and pulled out my phone. My hands were completely steady. The trembling fear of a battered spouse had evaporated the moment the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me. I unlocked the screen and bypassed my standard contacts list, ignoring the numbers for local art suppliers and budget-friendly takeout restaurants I had frequented to keep up the charade. Instead, I opened a hidden encrypted application buried deep within my phone settings. It was a direct, untraceable line to the executive suites of Vanguard Holdings, a line I had sworn I would never use while trying to build a normal life. I pressed the single contact name listed on the black screen and held the phone to my ear. The line rang only once. It was immediately answered by a voice that possessed the kind of deep, terrifying calmness that only comes from wielding absolute global power. "Yes," my father said. He did not ask who was calling. He did not ask how my day was going. Jonathan Vanguard operated entirely on efficiency and intuition. "Dad," I said, my voice echoing slightly against the marble floors of the empty corridor. "Activate Protocol 0. I am entirely done playing the struggling wife." There was a heavy loaded silence on the other end of the connection. I could hear the faint sound of a heavy fountain pen being set down on a solid mahogany desk hundreds of miles away in his New York office. When my father spoke again, the temperature of his voice had dropped several degrees. "Are you physically injured, Cassidy?" he asked. The question was not a display of parental panic. It was an assessment of damages before calculating the appropriate level of retaliation. "He hit me," I replied evenly, staring at my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. "I have a split lip and some bruising. He threw me out of the apartment and told me I was a worthless college dropout who would starve without his charity. To top it off, his assistant Sienna is currently sitting on his couch, wearing Mom's vintage emerald necklace." The silence returned thicker and more dangerous than before. My father had been waiting for this phone call since the day I first brought Derek home. During that excruciating introductory dinner, my father had watched Derek brag about his mid-level executive position at a tech startup, talking over me and demanding praise for his mediocre achievements. After Derek had left, my father pulled me aside and told me the man was a textbook narcissist. He warned me that Derek did not love me. Derek loved the power he felt he held over me. He loved feeling like a savior to a helpless, broke artist. But my father had respected my stubborn desire to try. He had agreed to let me live my lie on one condition. We established Protocol 0, a contingency plan ready to be deployed the second the illusion broke. "I should have listened to you 2 years ago," I admitted, tracing the outline of the dried blood on my chin. "You saw exactly what he was." "Do not ever apologize for having a hopeful heart, Cassidy," my father said, his tone shifting into pure, unadulterated business. "You wanted to see the good in a peasant's soul, but a rat only knows how to act like a rat. Now we handle this our way. Give me 10 minutes. I will make sure his precious tech company does not exist by the time he finishes his morning coffee. I need him ruined financially before I serve the divorce papers," I said, feeling the dormant executive energy waking up inside my chest. "He thinks he can force me into a penniless divorce and leave me with his debts. He thinks he holds all the leverage. I am deploying Kendra to Chicago immediately, my father instructed. Your sister-in-law has been itching for a hostile takeover, and she specializes in obliterating arrogant men. She will act as your legal counsel and handle the asset extraction. As for his company, I am initiating a coordinated withdrawal of their venture capital funding through our offshore subsidiaries right now. He touched Mom's necklace. I added, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. He pawned the real one and replaced it with a fake to fund his affair. My father took a sharp breath. He put his hands on my daughter and he stole from my late wife. Destroying his startup is just the opening move, Cassidy. We are going to erase his entire reality. Wait in the lobby. A security detail is en route to your location now. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The disguise I had worn for 2 years was officially dead. I was no longer Cassidy, the grateful, impoverished wife. I was Cassidy Vanguard, and I was about to teach my husband a masterclass in total destruction. I picked up the handle of my broken suitcase and took a step toward the elevator banks. Just as my hand hovered over the call button, a muffled, frantic sound bled through the thick walls of the apartment behind me. It was Derek's phone. The ringtone blared continuously, an urgent, panicked sound echoing down the quiet hallway. He had just received the call from his startup's chief executive officer. The offshore funding had been pulled. The bank accounts were frozen. The financial guillotine had just dropped on his neck, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman he had just kicked out was the one holding the rope. I smiled a genuine cold smile as the elevator doors slid open to carry me down. 42 floors above the lobby, the heavy oak door of our apartment clicked shut, leaving Derek standing in the foyer with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He rolled his shoulders, feeling like a king who had just successfully banished a peasant. He walked into the sprawling, sunlit living room, pouring himself a generous glass of expensive bourbon to celebrate his newly acquired freedom. He took a slow sip, savoring the burn of the alcohol, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to collapse. Before he could even set the crystal glass down on the marble kitchen island, his phone began to vibrate violently against the countertop. The ringtone blared through the quiet apartment, harsh and demanding. Derek glanced at the screen, his confident smile widening when he saw the caller identification. It was Gregory, the chief executive officer of the tech startup where Derek worked. Derek cleared his throat, adjusting his posture even though he was alone in the kitchen, and swiped to answer the call. He assumed Gregory was calling to congratulate him on the quarterly projections he submitted last night. Gregory. Good morning, Derek said smoothly, injecting his voice with that signature overconfident drawl he used to assert dominance. I am just reviewing the final phase of our upcoming launch before I head into the office. I think we are positioned for a massive breakout this week. Shut up and listen to me! Gregory screamed through the speaker. His voice was shrill, raw, and completely unhinged, vibrating with a level of blind panic Derek had never heard before. What the hell did you do? Who the hell did you piss off? Derek blinked, his smile instantly vanishing. The crystal glass in his hand suddenly felt very heavy. What are you talking about? Derek asked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Everything is perfectly fine. I just finalized the marketing push yesterday. Nothing is fine. Gregory roared, the sound of frantic typing and muffled shouting echoing in the background of the call. 10 minutes ago, an anonymous offshore entity executed a massive coordinated withdrawal of our primary venture capital funding. They pulled everything, Derek. Every single dime of our Series C funding just evaporated into thin air. Our stock is in an absolute free fall. We are down 40% and dropping by the second. Derek felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach plummeted as if he had just stepped off a cliff. He gripped the edge of the granite countertop, his knuckles turning white. That is impossible, he stammered, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The funding was locked in. The escrow accounts were secured by federal contracts. They cannot just withdraw capital without a formal board vote and a mandatory 30-day notice period. They did not just withdraw it, you arrogant idiot. They bypassed the escrow entirely. Gregory shouted, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. The bank just called me directly. Our main operating accounts have been completely frozen, pending an immediate federal audit. Some major anonymous shareholder initiated a hostile block and triggered an investigation into our financial discrepancies. We cannot make payroll tomorrow. We cannot pay our server hosting fees. The entire company is functionally bankrupt as of 5 minutes ago. Derek could barely breathe. His mind spun wildly, desperately trying to comprehend the catastrophe. This startup was his entire life. He had tied his entire identity, his personal loans, and his future stock options to this company. If the startup went under, he was personally liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in leveraged debt. He had borrowed heavily against his unvested shares to afford the luxury car in the garage and the expensive dinners he constantly bought for Sienna. "I will fix this," Derek said desperately, sweat beading on his forehead as he paced the length of the kitchen. "I have contacts at the bank. I can call the investment group and smooth things over. Just tell me who initiated the block." "We do not know," Gregory yelled, his voice echoing through the sterile apartment. "It came from a parent company heavily layered in impenetrable blind trusts. But the legal notice explicitly flagged your department. The auditors are demanding your specific division's expense reports. You need to get your ass into this office right now, Derek. If this audit finds a single cent out of place, I am offering you up to the feds on a silver platter to save myself. Fix it, or you are fired." The line went dead with a sharp click. Derek stared at his phone, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He leaned against the counter, trying to stop his hands from shaking. This had to be a mistake. A massive, catastrophic computer error. There was no way a multi-million-dollar tech startup could just collapse in the span of 10 minutes. From the living room, a frustrated, high-pitched sigh broke through his panicked thoughts. Sienna was sitting on the white leather sofa, her long legs crossed, tapping her manicured nails aggressively against her phone screen. The vintage emerald necklace still rested against her collarbone, a sparkling stolen contrast to her growing irritation. "Derek, your stupid card is not working," Sienna whined, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "I am trying to order that limited edition designer handbag we looked at last week to soothe my nerves after your crazy wife attacked me. But the site keeps saying the transaction is declined." Derek swallowed hard, trying to force his racing heart to slow down. "Just try it again," he called out, his voice wavering slightly, despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "It is probably just a network glitch. The banking servers have been acting up all morning." "I tried it 3 times," Sienna snapped, standing up and stomping into the kitchen. She waved her phone angrily in his face. "It is not a glitch. The bank sent an automated alert. Your supplementary credit line has been suspended. Did you forget to pay the bill again? You know how much I hate being embarrassed like this. I cannot even buy a simple $5,000 bag without your accounts freezing." Derek snatched the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the bright red error message on the screen. It was true. The corporate credit card he used for his personal expenses, the exact same card tied to the company accounts that were just frozen, was completely dead. He had absolutely zero cash flow. His personal checking account was linked to the same institution, which meant his entire financial existence was currently locked in a vault he could not access. "Fix it," Sienna demanded, crossing her arms and jutting out her lower lip. "I earned that bag for putting up with your wife screaming today." Derek stared at the error message on the screen. The sheer panic inside his chest twisted instantly into a familiar, toxic rage. He could not yell at his powerful CEO. He could not yell at the massive federal bank. So he directed his fury at the only target he thought was beneath him. "This is her fault," he muttered, his jaw clenching so tightly his teeth ground together. "Whose fault?" Sienna asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Cassidy, Derek spat, tossing the phone carelessly onto the counter. "She probably called the credit card company and reported the card stolen just to be vindictive because I threw her out. She is trying to sabotage me because she knows she is entirely dependent on my money. She thinks she can freeze my accounts to force me to take her back." Sienna rolled her eyes, a cruel smile forming on her lips. "That is so pathetic. What are you going to do?" Derek straightened his collar, his blinding arrogance returning to mask his profound terror. "I am going to the office to clear up this minor company misunderstanding. Then I am going to have my lawyers draft a divorce agreement that leaves her absolutely destitute. She wants to play games with my money. I will make sure she spends the rest of her life paying off my debts so I can marry you. She is a broke, pathetic amateur, and I am going to crush her." The morning light filtered through the frosted skylights of my art restoration studio in the West Loop. I sat calmly on a wooden stool sipping black coffee, surrounded by the familiar smells of linseed oil and aged varnish. I had slept perfectly in a luxury hotel suite secured by my father, but I returned to the studio at dawn, wearing my usual oversized paint-splattered overalls. I knew exactly where Derek would go when his panic hardened into desperate aggression. Right on schedule, the heavy industrial door of my studio flew open with a violent crash that rattled the antique frames on the plaster walls. Derek marched inside, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set in a rigid line of manic determination. Sienna trailed right behind him, clutching a designer coffee cup and wearing a smug, practiced pout. Derek marched straight to my main work table, knocking aside a jar of expensive solvent and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the wood. "Sign it," Derek barked, jabbing his finger onto the top page. I did not flinch. I slowly set my coffee mug down and glanced at the title of the document. It was a marital settlement agreement hastily drafted and printed on cheap paper. I flipped to the financial clauses, my eyes scanning the heavily bolded paragraphs. It was a masterpiece of masculine delusion. The contract explicitly demanded a complete zero-asset split. It stipulated that I would forfeit any right to alimony, relinquish my claim to our shared apartment, and laughably assume 50% of the personal loans he had taken out to fund his startup investments. He was legally attempting to strap his sinking financial anchors to my back before his ship fully went under. "You want me to take on your debt?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and curious. "You lived off my paycheck for 2 years," Derek sneered, leaning over the table to intimidate me. "You enjoyed the luxury apartment. You ate the food I bought. You owe me for dragging my success down with your pathetic little hobby. I am cutting you loose, Cassidy. Sign the papers and take the debt, or I will drag this out in court until you are completely ruined. We both know you do not have a dime to hire a lawyer anyway. You cannot even afford to fix that broken suitcase you dragged out of my house last night." Sienna let out a sharp, mocking laugh from the corner of the room. She leaned against a stack of canvases, crossing her arms. "You really should just sign it, Cassidy. Derek is being generous by not suing you for emotional distress. You know, since you attacked me. Plus, his company is about to go public. He has extremely important meetings today, and you are just a distraction. We need this dead weight gone so we can plan our future together." I looked at Sienna, noting the absence of my mother's emerald necklace. She had likely hidden it away, afraid I might try to snatch it off her neck. She had no idea I had already flagged the piece in the global insurance registry. Before I could respond to their absurd demands, the studio door swung open again. This time, the heavy footsteps belonged to Derek's parents, Richard and Susan. They marched into my workspace with the same suffocating entitlement their son possessed. Susan wore a heavy fur coat that smelled of mothballs, her face pinched in a permanent scowl of disapproval. They had never liked me. From the day of our cheap City Hall wedding, Susan had treated me like a parasitic gold digger who had somehow tricked her brilliant tech genius son into a trap of mediocrity. "Have you signed it yet?" Susan demanded, not even bothering to greet me. She stepped up beside Derek, placing a protective hand on his shoulder while glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Cassidy. We all knew this marriage was a mistake from the beginning. You never belonged in our world." "Your world," I repeated softly, savoring the bitter irony of her words. "Yes, our world," Susan snapped, stepping closer, her voice dripping with venom. "Men at Derek's level have certain needs and strict expectations. They require a partner who elevates their status, not someone who hides in a dusty basement sniffing paint fumes all day. If you cannot keep a successful tech executive happy, you deserve to be replaced by someone who can." Sienna understands the corporate lifestyle. You are just an anchor. Sign the papers and stop holding him back from his true potential. Richard chimed in, pointing a stern finger at my face. "My son has a massive executive payout coming next month when his firm goes public. He is not going to let a freeloading ex-wife take a cut of the empire he built with his own 2 hands. We have a judge friend who will finalize these papers by tomorrow morning. If you fight this, we will make sure you are blacklisted from every gallery in Chicago. You will not even be able to sell finger paintings by the time we are done with you." The sheer audacity of their threats was breathtaking. Derek stood there, flanked by his mistress and his enabling parents, puffing out his chest like a triumphant gladiator. He truly believed he had me cornered. He thought he had outsmarted the legal system using intimidation and fear to force me into signing away my rights before the reality of his total financial ruin became public knowledge. He was desperately trying to secure his escape pod, while his corporate ship was already sinking into the icy depths. I looked down at the pathetic divorce contract. I reached into the deep pocket of my overalls and pulled out a cheap plastic pen. Derek's eyes lit up with victorious greed. He actually thought I was going to surrender. He took a half step forward, his hand twitching, ready to snatch the paper away the exact second my ink hit the signature line. I clicked the pen, but I did not write my name. Instead, the heavy industrial door of my studio swung open for a third time. The sudden, forceful movement caught the immediate attention of everyone in the room. Through the open doorway, parked illegally on the curb directly outside my studio, sat a sleek, custom-armored black town car. The powerful engine idled with a low, menacing purr that vibrated through the floorboards. The studio fell completely silent as a stunning woman stepped into the doorway. She wore a razor-sharp, perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit that screamed unapologetic wealth and lethal authority. Her high heels clicked against the concrete floor with rhythmic, intimidating precision. Flanking her on either side were two massive, stone-faced bodyguards whose sheer physical presence instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Derek swallowed hard, his triumphant smile faltering as the towering men crossed their arms, entirely blocking his only exit from the building. The woman stepped fully into the studio, the sharp click of her heels echoing like a ticking clock against the concrete floor. This was Kendra, my sister-in-law, and one of the most ruthless corporate mergers and acquisitions attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. Her pristine, tailored suit contrasted sharply with the dusty, paint-splattered surroundings of my workspace. She adjusted her designer glasses, her dark eyes locking onto Derek, with the detached clinical precision of a predator observing a particularly slow piece of prey. The two massive bodyguards behind her shifted their weight, their broad shoulders completely sealing off the heavy industrial door. Nobody was leaving. Derek took a hesitant step back, bumping into the edge of my work table. His mother, Susan, let out a quiet gasp, her hand flying to the collar of her mothball-scented fur coat. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority, but the sheer physical presence of the men guarding the door made him look like a frightened child. Sienna shrank back against the stacked canvases, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that she was wearing stolen jewelry in a room that suddenly felt very dangerous. Kendra did not offer a greeting. She did not introduce herself with pleasantries. She simply marched straight to the wooden table, picked up Derek's cheaply printed marital settlement agreement between her perfectly manicured fingers, and dropped it into a nearby trash can. Before Derek could even open his mouth to protest, Kendra slammed a massive gold-embossed legal file onto the wood. The heavy thud made Sienna jump. "I am Kendra Vanguard, serving as chief legal counsel for Cassidy," she announced, her voice resonating with absolute, unbreakable authority. "I have reviewed your pathetic excuse for a contract. Surprisingly, my client completely agrees to your core demand of a zero-asset split. In fact, she insists on it. She does not want a single penny of your money, nor does she want any claim to your leased apartment or your heavily leveraged vehicle. We have drafted a binding ironclad separation agreement reflecting these exact terms. Sign here, here, and here." Kendra clicked a heavy silver fountain pen and slid it across the table. It rolled to a stop right against Derek's knuckles. Derek stared at the thick legal document, then looked up at Kendra, his initial panic melting into a loud, obnoxious laugh. The sound was harsh and grating, filled with the blinding arrogance of a man who desperately needed to believe he was the smartest person in the room. He looked at me, shaking his head in mock pity. "Is this the best you could do, Cassidy?" Derek sneered, picking up the heavy silver pen. "You actually went out and found some desperate pro bono legal aid lawyer to print out a fancy-looking binder just to try and intimidate me. This is hilarious. You are completely broke. You cannot even afford a decent haircut, let alone a high-powered attorney. You are just trying to save face in front of my parents because you know you lost." Susan let out a sharp, condescending chuckle, her confidence returning as she mirrored her son's arrogance. "She really is pathetic, Derek." I told you she would try some theatrical stunt to make herself look important. Just sign the ridiculous papers and let us get out of this filthy basement. I can barely breathe in here." Richard crossed his arms, looking at Kendra with a dismissive smirk. "You legal aid types always try to dress up to look intimidating," he said, his tone dripping with privileged superiority. "But you are advising your client to walk away with absolutely nothing. You are letting her take on his personal debt while forfeiting any right to alimony. You must be the worst lawyer in the city. But fine, if she wants to be stupid enough to walk away empty-handed, we will gladly accept her surrender." Derek did not bother reading the fine print. He was too consumed by his own monumental ego, too eager to finalize his escape from a woman he considered a financial burden. He wanted to get back to his imploding tech startup and fix his frozen bank accounts, convinced that shedding me was the first step to saving his impending executive payout. He scribbled his signature across the 3 designated lines, pressing so hard the ink nearly bled through the thick parchment. "There," Derek spat, tossing the silver pen back across the table. "You get 0 alimony. You get none of my stock options. You get absolutely nothing. You can take your little paintbrushes and your pro bono lawyer and rot in this studio. Good luck paying off my credit cards, you useless parasite." Kendra did not blink. She did not react to the insults or the mocking laughter echoing from his parents. She simply reached out with smooth, deliberate precision and collected the signed documents. She checked the signatures, ensured they were legally binding, and carefully slipped the gold-embossed file into her sleek leather briefcase. The metallic snap of the briefcase closing sounded like a steel trap locking into place. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across Kendra's face. She leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the work table, bringing her face just inches from Derek's smug expression. The sudden shift in her demeanor made his arrogant smile falter. "You really should have read the fine print, Derek," Kendra whispered, her voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence that sliced through the tension in the room. "By rushing to sign a 0-asset split without demanding a standard financial disclosure, you just legally waived your right to a period of financial discovery. You formally agreed that neither party is entitled to any assets acquired by the other party during the marriage. You just legally divorced yourself from a woman whose personal investment portfolio is currently valued at over $2 billion. You walked away from an empire, and you did it with a huge smile. Congratulations." The echo of Kendra's words hung in the dusty air of the restoration studio, heavy and suffocating. Derek stared at the impeccable woman standing before him, his brain violently rejecting the information it had just received. For a fraction of a second, genuine terror flashed behind his bloodshot eyes. Then his fragile ego kicked in, deploying its favorite defense mechanism. He threw his head back and let out a sharp, braying laugh that bounced off the brick walls. He slapped his hand against his thigh, shaking his head as if he had just heard the punchline to a brilliant joke. $2 billion. Derek wheezed, wiping a fake tear from the corner of his eye. "You expect me to believe that my wife, the woman who spends her weekends scraping grime off old paintings for pennies, is secretly a billionaire heiress? This is pathetic, Cassidy, truly. I knew you were desperate, but hiring a theatrical fake lawyer to come in here and spout absolute nonsense is a new low even for you." Sienna joined in her high-pitched giggles, grating against my ears. She clung to Derek's bicep, looking at me with pure pity. "It is honestly embarrassing," Sienna chimed in, twisting a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. "You are just trying to scare him because you know he is about to become a wildly wealthy executive, and you are getting nothing. You should have just signed the papers quietly and kept whatever shred of dignity you have left." Kendra did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply unclasped her briefcase again with a sharp metallic click that instantly silenced their laughter. She reached inside and withdrew a thick, glossy financial dossier, dropping it onto the wooden work table right next to the empty space where the divorce agreement had been. The cover of the dossier bore the unmistakable, globally recognized crest of Vanguard Holdings. "I am not a fake lawyer, Derek," Kendra said, her voice smooth and lethal. "My name is Kendra Vanguard. I am a senior partner at Vanguard Legal, and I manage the private acquisitions portfolio for the Vanguard Family Trust. The trust that currently names Cassidy as its sole primary beneficiary." Derek's smile faltered, but his arrogance refused to die. "Vanguard," he repeated, crossing his arms. "Anyone can print a logo on a folder. You are bluffing. If she had that kind of money, she would not be living in an apartment I pay for. She would not be wearing clothes from thrift stores. She wore those clothes because she was conducting a social experiment? Kendra replied, her dark eyes locking onto his. She wanted to see if she could find a man who valued her intellect and her character over her net worth. Unfortunately, her hypothesis was proven correct. You only valued her when you felt superior to her. You used your mediocre tech salary to financially abuse a woman who could buy your entire corporate sector with the spare change in her checking account. Kendra opened the dossier. She pulled out a stack of bank statements and slid the first one across the table. Let us talk about your precious tech startup, Derek, the one you claim to have built with your own two hands. Do you recognize the name of the venture capital firm that provided your Series C funding last year? Derek glanced at the paper, his jaw tightening. Apex Global Investments, he muttered. They are a massive offshore entity. What does that have to do with anything? Apex Global Investments is a subsidiary, Kendra stated, tapping a manicured nail against the document. A subsidiary entirely owned and operated by Vanguard Holdings. Cassidy authorized that funding. She personally approved the capital injection that kept your failing company afloat. She is your primary investor. She is the offshore entity that just pulled every single dime of capital out of your accounts this morning. The color completely drained from Derek's face. The arrogant flush vanished, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His eyes darted frantically across the banking documents, his mind struggling to connect the dots. The frozen accounts, the panicked phone call from his CEO, the sudden, inexplicable suspension of his corporate credit lines. It was not a bank glitch. It was an execution. You did this, Derek whispered, his voice trembling as he finally looked at me, seeing me not as his submissive wife, but as his executioner. You froze my accounts. I simply withdrew my personal investments from a highly volatile and poorly managed asset. I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. You repeatedly told me I contributed nothing to our household. I decided to stop contributing. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally took hold of him. He lunged forward, his hands scrambling across the wooden table, desperately trying to grab the leather briefcase Kendra had locked away. Give me that contract back, he roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. The divorce agreement is void. I was coerced. Give it back right now. Before his fingers could even brush the leather, the two massive bodyguards stepped forward in perfect unison. They did not draw weapons. They simply moved their imposing frames into his path, forming an impenetrable wall of solid muscle. Derek slammed into a chest that felt like pure granite and stumbled backward, nearly knocking over his mother. The contract is fully executed, Kendra said, her smirk returning as she watched him scramble. You signed it of your own free will in front of 4 witnesses. You explicitly demanded a zero-asset split. You eagerly waived your right to financial discovery because you were so desperate to leave Cassidy with nothing. You legally barricaded yourself away from a $2 billion fortune, all because your ego could not tolerate the idea of a woman being more successful than you. Sienna let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at Derek, her eyes wide with terror. Derek, she stammered, her voice shaking. Are you broke? Is your company really bankrupt? What about the condo we were going to buy? Derek ignored her, his chest heaving as he stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He was trapped in a financial prison of his own making, and the realization was suffocating him. He had spent 2 years treating me like a charity case, only to discover he had been the charity case all along. The ultimate provider was nothing more than a subsidized dependent. The power dynamic he so desperately craved had been completely reversed, and the humiliation was absolute. Susan, Derek's mother, finally broke the stunned silence. She pushed past her husband Richard, her face contorted into a mask of bitter, desperate denial. She refused to accept the reality unfolding in front of her. To acknowledge my wealth meant acknowledging her son's catastrophic failure, and her fragile, elitist worldview simply could not handle the cognitive dissonance. She pulled her fur coat tighter around her shoulders, lifting her chin in a pathetic display of manufactured superiority. This is all smoke and mirrors, Susan declared, her voice trembling slightly but laced with venom. You can print all the fake bank statements you want, Cassidy, but it does not change the facts. Derek is a rising star in the tech industry, and you are a manipulative little liar who paints in a basement. You have no real power, you have no real assets. By the time this divorce is finalized, you will be begging on the streets. You will be completely homeless, and we will make sure absolutely no one in this city lifts a finger to help you." Richard nodded vigorously, stepping up beside his wife to present a united front of delusion. "My wife is exactly right," he scoffed, pointing a finger at my chest. "You think you can just walk in here with some hired muscle and a briefcase full of fake papers and intimidate us? We are respectable, established people. We own a luxury estate in the suburbs. We have connections. You are going to be living in a cardboard box by the end of the month, and we are going to enjoy watching every single second of it." Kendra let out a slow, melodic laugh that sent a chill through the room. She turned her sharp, calculating gaze away from Derek and fixed it squarely on his parents. The amusement in her dark eyes was absolutely terrifying. She reached into the interior pocket of her tailored suit jacket and slowly withdrew a folded piece of heavy watermarked parchment. "Speaking of homelessness," Kendra said, her voice echoing with lethal precision, "I am so glad you brought up your living arrangements, Richard. Let us talk about that luxury suburban estate you love to brag about at your country club dinners." Susan's face twitched. "What about our house?" she demanded, her tone defensive. Kendra unfolded the heavy parchment and held it up by the corners, presenting it to them like a royal decree. "This is a certified property deed," Kendra announced, reading the bold text at the top of the page. "The 6-bedroom, 4-bathroom colonial home you currently reside in was purchased exactly 3 years ago through an anonymous expedited blind trust." Do you remember that day, Richard? Do you remember when your logistics business quietly filed for bankruptcy and you were days away from defaulting on your previous mortgage? You thought a miracle angel investor had swooped in to buy your new house and lease it back to you at a fraction of the market rate to save your reputation. Richard's face drained of color. The arrogant sneer melted off his lips, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "That blind trust was funded entirely by Cassidy." Kendra continued, her voice rising in volume, commanding the attention of every person in the room. "She bought that house to save Derek the humiliation of seeing his parents destitute. She subsidized your luxurious lifestyle. She paid your property taxes. She covered the maintenance fees on your manicured lawns. You have been living in a house owned by the very woman you just called a manipulative liar." Susan gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to grip Richard's arm. "No, that is impossible. Derek paid for the lease. Derek told us he handled the investor." "Derek took the credit," I interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Kendra. Derek loved playing the role of the successful son rescuing his struggling parents. But Derek never had the capital. I bought the property and I allowed him to pretend he was the savior. I let you live there because I believed family protected each other. "But you are no longer family," Kendra stated coldly, dropping the deed onto the work table next to the Vanguard dossier. "And since your son explicitly forced my client out of her primary residence last night with a split lip and a broken suitcase, the terms of your charitable lease have been officially revoked. The bank is executing a rapid foreclosure protocol on the property. The local sheriff's department will arrive at your front door at exactly 5 p.m. today to change the locks and secure the premises. I suggest you leave this studio right now and go pack your bags. You have roughly 8 hours before you are officially trespassing on Vanguard property." The studio erupted into absolute chaos. Susan let out a piercing, hysterical scream, burying her face in her hands as her knees buckled. Richard caught her, his face purple with rage and terror, screaming incoherently about lawyers and tenant rights. Sienna backed away from the group, her eyes darting frantically toward the door, realizing she had hitched her wagon to a family that was completely financially radioactive. Derek snapped. The total destruction of his ego, his career, and his family's fabricated status was too much for his narcissistic brain to process. His face twisted into a mask of pure feral rage. He let out a guttural roar and charged directly at Kendra. His fists raised, completely ignoring the reality of the situation. He did not make it 2 steps. The bodyguard on the left moved with terrifying, blinding speed. He stepped forward, caught Derek by the collar of his expensive dress shirt, and effortlessly lifted him off his feet. With a single fluid motion, the massive man slammed Derek backward against the studio's plaster drywall. The impact shook the entire room, knocking a cloud of white dust from the ceiling beams. The bodyguard pinned Derek against the wall by his throat, his forearm pressing firmly against Derek's windpipe, holding him suspended inches above the concrete floor. Derek gasped for air, his legs kicking uselessly. He tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth as his split lip tore open further from the impact. Pinned against the drywall, totally helpless and utterly defeated, his delusion still refused to die. "You cannot do this to me!" Derek screamed, spitting a fine mist of blood onto the lapel of his own ruined shirt. "My company is going public next month. The IPO is locked. When I get my executive payout, I am going to buy you out. I am going to sue you for everything. I will crush all of you." Kendra looked at the man dangling from the wall, her expression shifting from cold calculation to genuine amusement. She tilted her head back and laughed, a bright ringing sound that cut through his desperate threats. The sound of Kendra's laughter bounced off the brick walls, sharp and unyielding. With a subtle flick of her wrist, she signaled the bodyguard. He released his grip, letting Derek drop to the concrete floor like a discarded rag. Derek scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his hand clutching his bruised throat. His parents were still frozen in terror, unable to comprehend the sudden destruction of their fabricated empire. Derek did not stay to comfort them. He grabbed Sienna by the wrist, dragging her toward the door and pushing past the towering bodyguards, desperate to escape the suffocating reality. He practically shoved Sienna into the passenger seat of his leased sports car, slamming the door before racing around to the driver's side. The engine roared as he sped away from the curb, his knuckles turning white against the leather steering wheel. His mind raced frantically, attempting to reconstruct his shattered ego. Cassidy was a liar. Kendra was a fraud. It was all an elaborate intimidation tactic. It had to be. His tech startup Neural Net Solutions was only weeks away from a massive public offering. His executive payout was guaranteed. He just needed to get to his corporate office quickly. He needed to placate the board of directors and fix the frozen bank accounts before the financial rumors leaked to the press. Beside him, Sienna sat in rigid silence, her eyes glued to her glowing phone screen. The smug, practiced pout she had worn in the studio was entirely gone. While Derek swerved through downtown traffic, she frantically refreshed her banking app. Red error messages flashed across her screen. The joint credit card Derek had given her was declined. Her luxury gym membership auto draft had bounced. The brutal reality of his frozen assets was hitting her like ice water. She glanced sideways at Derek, taking in his split lip, his frantic sweating, and the stench of his desperation. Her calculated mind immediately shifted gears. She had not spent 2 years playing the devoted mistress to end up with a bankrupt fraud facing massive legal ruin. She subtly slid her phone into her designer handbag, her posture turning icy and distant. The exit strategy was already forming in her head. Derek slammed the brakes as they reached the sleek glass building housing his corporate office. He left the car with the valet and sprinted through the busy main front lobby. He left Sienna trailing far behind without a second thought. He burst through the glass doors of his executive suite, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. The office was in a state of absolute chaos. Analysts were shouting into telephones, junior executives were frantically packing boxes, and the digital ticker displaying their stock valuation was ominously blank. Derek ignored the panic and marched straight into the glass-walled boardroom. The 3 remaining senior board members sat around the mahogany table looking completely shell-shocked. They looked up as Derek barged in, their expressions shifting from panic to sheer, utter contempt. Derek immediately launched into his practiced pitch, flashing his signature charismatic smile, despite the dried blood on his chin. He straightened his ruined collar, attempting to project absolute authority. "Gentlemen, please remain calm," Derek announced, pacing confidently around the room. "I know there are rumors circulating about a hostile takeover, and yes, we are experiencing a temporary liquidity freeze due to a banking error. But I have everything completely under control. Vanguard Holdings is simply flexing their muscles to force a better valuation before the public offering. They need us. They need my leadership, my vision, and my proprietary algorithms. I will make this launch a massive success. I am handling the negotiations personally. We just need to hold the line." The chairman of the board, a balding man named Arthur, let out a harsh, incredulous breath. He stood up, tossing a stack of legal notices onto the table. You are completely delusional, Derek. Arthur shouted, his face purple with rage. This is not a negotiation. It is a slaughter. Vanguard Holdings did not just freeze our accounts. They executed a hostile buyout of our offshore debt overnight. They own 80% of our massive equity. We have no power. Here, we have no leverage and no capital. The anonymous Vanguard CEO is cleaning house, and your name is at the absolute top of the termination list. You are a liability, and we are voting to formally strip you of your title by the end of the day. Derek felt the floor drop out from under him. The board members were packing their briefcases, abandoning the sinking ship he had steered directly into a storm. His charm was useless. His lies were entirely ineffective. The illusion of his power had been completely stripped away, leaving him standing totally alone inside. He retreated to his private office, locking the heavy oak door securely behind him. Panic squeezed his chest, stealing his breath. He could not lose this job. He could not lose the millions of dollars tied up in his executive payout. Without that money, he was absolutely nothing. He had no house, no wife, and no assets. Desperation overrode his arrogance. He booted up his laptop and opened his email client. He frantically typed a message directed to the heavily guarded executive contact address for Vanguard Holdings. It was a pathetic, groveling plea for professional mercy. He typed furiously now. He sold out Arthur and the board, begging the anonymous CEO for a single meeting. He promised ruthless efficiency and unquestioning loyalty if they allowed him to keep his position through the public offering. 10 minutes later, a sharp ping echoed. Derek jolted forward. It was a direct reply from the Vanguard CEO's office. Your performance will be evaluated in person, the email read. See me at the Vanguard Holdings annual gala on Friday. Derek stared at the screen, a massive, triumphant grin spreading across his bruised face. He leaned back, absolutely convinced he had just won the corporate lottery. The following morning, Derek strode through the revolving glass doors of Neural Net Solutions with the manufactured swagger of a conquering emperor. He wore his most expensive tailored suit, concealing the fact that he had slept on the leather sofa in his office. His parents were currently dealing with a rapid eviction notice at their suburban estate, but Derek mentally blocked out their frantic phone calls. All that mattered was the upcoming gala. The Vanguard CEO had personally summoned him. He was convinced this meant an executive promotion, a massive equity grant, and the total restoration of his frozen bank accounts. He swiped his badge at the turnstile, expecting nods from the staff. Instead, the security guard did not even look up. The turnstile flashed a harsh red light, buzzing angrily. Derek frowned, assuming it was a simple glitch, and vaulted over the barrier. He marched toward the elevators, adjusting his tie. When the doors parted, his grin evaporated instantly. The C-suite was completely unrecognizable. The reception area had been transformed into a zone of corporate auditing. Derek froze, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the hostile takeover. The entire executive management team was gone. Arthur's corner office was dark, wiped clean of his nameplate. The executive desks were barren, stripped down to bare polished wood. Replacing them was an army of Vanguard operatives moving with terrifying efficiency. Men and women in navy suits swarmed the corridors, their expressions devoid of emotion. They pulled hard drives, boxed ledgers, and sealed cabinets with tamper-evident tape. 2 men dismantled the server racks, securing components in aluminum cases. It was a total corporate purge. Derek felt a cold sweat break out. His heart hammered as a woman with a clipboard marched past, ignoring him entirely. He needed to assert dominance. He needed to prove he was the vital organ keeping this company alive. He puffed his chest, plastered a smile onto his face, and intercepted a tall man directing the removal. "Excuse me, Derek," announced, projecting his voice. "I am Derek Sterling, head of development. I understand Vanguard is auditing ahead of our public offering, but I need access to my servers immediately to ensure our deployment remains uninterrupted." The tall man stopped writing on his clipboard. He looked Derek up and down, his eyes lingering on the swelling of Derek's split lip. He did not offer his hand. "We are not conducting a preliminary audit, Mr. Sterling," the man stated with a voice like crushed ice. "We are securing the intellectual property Vanguard acquired during last night's asset liquidation. There is no public offering. Neural Net Solutions no longer exists as an independent entity. Your deployment schedule is irrelevant. Derek swallowed hard. He opened his mouth to argue to invoke his upcoming meeting with the CEO when a flash of bright crimson caught his eye. Sienna was strutting down the hallway carrying a tray of expensive artisanal coffees. She had arrived early, likely seeking refuge from the financial anxiety Derek caused her yesterday. Derek raised his hand to flag her down, but Sienna walked right past him. She did not even blink. Instead, she made a beeline for a handsome man standing near the boardroom. The man wore a bespoke suit and issued rapid-fire orders to the Vanguard legal team. He possessed the effortless aura of someone who controlled immense wealth. Sienna practically threw herself into his personal space. She offered him a latte with a dazzling, predatory smile, leaning forward just enough to ensure he noticed the plunging neckline of her silk blouse. Derek watched in absolute horror as Sienna laughed at something the man said, tossing her head back and lightly touching his forearm. It was the exact same manufactured breathless routine she had used to snare Derek 2 years ago. The interim director looked mildly amused by her aggressive flirting, taking the coffee and leaning against the glass wall to entertain her. Sienna was already running her exit strategy. She had smelled the blood in the water. She recognized that Derek was a sinking ship, stripped of his capital and his title, and she was immediately pivoting to secure a new host. Blind rage surged through Derek. He marched down the hallway, grabbed Sienna by the elbow, and violently yanked her away from the Vanguard executive. The director raised an eyebrow, but did not intervene, turning his attention back to his legal team. Derek dragged Sienna into the empty break room, letting the heavy door slam shut behind them. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Derek hissed, his face inches from hers. "I am fighting for my corporate life out there, and you are throwing yourself at the first guy in a nice suit who walks through the door." Sienna yanked her arm free, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a vicious sneer. There was no warmth left in her eyes, only cold, hard calculus. She crossed her arms, looking at him with absolute disgust. "Do not touch me, Derek," she snapped, her voice stripped of its usual breathy sweetness. "Look around you. You are done. You have no job. You have no equity. Your parents are getting evicted today. I am not going down with you. I need security, Derek. If you cannot get your accounts unfrozen, why should I stay?" Derek stepped back, staggered by her utter, ruthless lack of loyalty. He turned and fled the break room, locking himself inside his dark office. Desperation completely overrode his arrogance. He booted up his laptop and frantically typed a groveling email to the anonymous Vanguard CEO who just bought the startup, begging for a meeting to prove his worth. 10 minutes later, his screen pinged. He got a direct reply from the CEO's office. "Your performance will be evaluated in person. See me at the Vanguard Holdings annual gala on Friday." Derek stared at the screen, a massive triumphant grin spreading across his bruised face. He leaned back, absolutely convinced he had just won the corporate lottery. Derek's triumphant grin died in the glass elevator. Approaching the parking kiosk, he swiped his titanium credit card. The screen glared back with a red declined message. Annoyed, he tried his corporate card. Declined. A buzz vibrated in his pocket. He pulled out his phone to find automated alerts flooding his screen. Every financial institution tied to his name had flagged his accounts for suspicious activity. His checking, savings, and emergency credit lines all were frozen. He had zero cash flow. Used to throwing money at inconveniences, he could not even afford the parking fee to retrieve his own vehicle. He sweet-talked the confused garage attendant, leveraging his decaying status as a tech executive to get the gate raised. Returning to his upscale apartment, his nerves were frayed. He desperately needed quiet to strategize his pitch for the Vanguard Gala. Instead, he found Sienna standing in the living room, surrounded by shopping bags from boutiques visited before the sudden freeze hit. She held up an extremely stunning emerald silk designer gown, the price tag dangling from the long sleeve. "Derek," she demanded, "this is the dress I am wearing to the Vanguard Gala on Friday. It is exclusive and they are holding it for me. I need you to wire $15,000 right now so they can start the alterations." Derek stared at the shimmering fabric, his jaw tightening. "Sienna, we cannot do that today," he said, forcing a calm tone. "The banks are conducting a massive audit because of the Vanguard acquisition. All external transfers are suspended. You will have to wear something else from your closet. Sienna dropped the dress, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. Wear something else, she repeated, stepping toward him. You promised I would be the most important woman in the room when your company went public. You told me I was going to be an executive wife. If I attend the Vanguard Gala wearing last season's leftovers, I will look like a joke. And if I look like a joke, you look like a failure. Wire the money, Derek, or I am not going. And honestly, if you cannot even buy me a dress, I do not see why I should stay in this apartment. I need security, Derek. If you cannot get your accounts unfrozen, why should I stay? The audacity of her threat ignited a toxic rage deep in his chest. Derek had spent his entire marriage to Cassidy, wielding his paycheck like a loaded weapon. He used to relish the power of financial dominance, arbitrarily denying Cassidy household money just to watch her accept his authority. He controlled what she wore and where she went by controlling the purse strings. He expected Sienna to bow to the exact same dynamic, to shrink under his displeasure and beg for his favor. "Do not dare threaten me!" Derek roared, stepping into her personal space. "You are here because I pay for you to be here. You live in an apartment that I lease. You carry handbags that I bought. I am the provider. You get what I decide to give you, and right now you are getting nothing." Sienna did not shrink. She did not apologize the way Cassidy used to. Instead, she let out a mocking laugh that cut Derek to the bone. "You are not a provider, Derek," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a broke, pathetic fraud living on an allowance from the wife you thought you were manipulating. I am a woman who requires a return on her investment. You have no money, company, or power. Do not try to act like a king when your crown is made of plastic." The illusion of their passionate affair shattered violently. They spent the next hour tearing each other apart, trading vicious insults, exposing the shallow transactional core of their relationship. The polished executive and the glamorous mistress were reduced to desperate parasites fighting over a dead host. Sienna finally stormed into the master bedroom, violently locking the door, leaving Derek alone in the living room with his rapidly mounting panic. Meanwhile, across the city, the atmosphere inside the Vanguard Holdings data center was chillingly calm. Kendra Vanguard sat at a massive curved desk surrounded by glowing monitors. Sitting directly in front of her was Derek's encrypted work laptop, seized from his private office that morning. Derek had always bragged about his superior coding skills and impenetrable security protocols, convinced his secrets were safely buried. Kendra cracked her knuckles, her eyes fixed on the screen. She typed a rapid sequence of commands. She bypassed his firewalls in less than 3 minutes, cutting through security that was laughably rudimentary for someone managing a $2 billion empire. Plunging deeper into the hard drive, she scanned his local storage architecture. There, buried under convoluted system files, she found it. A hidden, heavily encrypted partition deliberately isolated from the main network. This encryption was sophisticated and paranoid. It took Kendra nearly 20 minutes of relentless coding to break the final cipher. When the folder finally decrypted, the sheer volume of data was staggering. Kendra leaned closer, her dark eyes scanning the neatly categorized files. There were offshore routing numbers, falsified expense reports, and thousands of pages of source code illegally copied from competing firms. But what truly caught her attention was a subfolder labeled Apex Contingency. She clicked it open and began reading. A slow, lethal smile spread across her face. The information went far beyond simple corporate mismanagement. It was concrete, undeniable proof of systematic embezzlement. Derek had not just been cheating on Cassidy. He had been actively stealing millions of dollars from the subsidiary Cassidy owned, funneling venture capital into secret, untraceable shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. "It changes the entire game," Kendra whispered to the empty room, her eyes gleaming with predatory anticipation. Derek was not just a narcissistic, abusive husband anymore. He was a federal criminal, and Kendra held the absolute proof. The panoramic view from the Vanguard Holdings penthouse boardroom offered a sweeping, unobstructed vista of the Chicago skyline. Cassidy stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the city lights flicker against the gathering twilight. For years, she had viewed this city from the cramped, dusty basement of the art restoration studio, completely detached from the towering steel monoliths that dictated the global economy. Now she stood at the absolute apex of it all. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a soft swoosh. Kendra strode into the room, radiating the kind of lethal, victorious energy that only came from landing a fatal blow. She carried a sleek silver tablet, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. She did not bother with pleasantries. She walked directly to the head of the massive conference table and swiped her finger across the tablet screen. The lights in the boardroom instantly dimmed. A massive digital projector whirred to life, illuminating the entire back wall with cascading streams of financial data, offshore routing numbers, and deeply encrypted transaction logs. Cassidy turned away from the window, her brow furrowing as she took in the dizzying array of numbers. "What exactly am I looking at?" Kendra Cassidy asked, walking slowly toward the illuminated wall. "You are looking at the absolute destruction of your soon-to-be ex-husband," Kendra declared, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I bypassed the firewalls on Derek's encrypted work laptop this afternoon. He thought he was a genius, but his security architecture was pathetic. I found a hidden partition on his hard drive. Derek did not just cheat on you, Cassidy. He committed textbook premeditated federal wire fraud." Cassidy froze. The implications of those words hung heavily in the air. Federal wire fraud. She stared at the highlighted red figures on the screen. He systematically embezzled exactly $2 million from neural net solutions over the past 18 months. Kendra continued tapping the screen to enlarge a specific series of transfers. He siphoned the money directly out of their primary research and development fund. He disguised the withdrawals as vendor payments and offshore server maintenance fees, but the capital never reached any vendors. He routed every single cent through a web of shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Cassidy felt a cold knot form in her stomach. $2 million. The exact amount of money he constantly bragged about securing for his company. "He stole it," Cassidy whispered, her eyes tracing the digital evidence. "Every last dime," Kendra confirmed, swiping to the next slide. "And I know exactly where it went. He did not invest it. He did not save it. He spent it on Sienna." The screen shifted to display a barrage of receipts, digital invoices, and luxury purchase orders. He bought her a leased sports car, funded her penthouse apartment, and purchased hundreds of thousands of dollars in designer clothing. He was funding a billionaire lifestyle on a stolen tech salary. But the best part is right here. Kendra tapped the tablet again. A high-resolution image of an emerald necklace appeared on the screen. It was the exact necklace Sienna had worn to Derek's company holiday party, the one she had so proudly flaunted in Cassidy's face. "Derek purchased this genuine emerald piece for $80,000 last year," Kendra explained, a vicious smile playing on her lips. "But a month ago, the venture capital audit started getting aggressive. He panicked. He needed liquid cash to cover a missing research and development payment. So he took the necklace back, pawned the real emeralds, and replaced them with laboratory-created fakes. Sienna has been walking around wearing cubic zirconia, completely convinced she hit the jackpot. She is dating a broke, desperate thief who cannot even afford to buy her real jewelry." Cassidy stared at this projected image of the fake emerald necklace. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The entire foundation of her marriage, the power dynamic that had suffocated her for years, suddenly shifted into sharp, blinding focus. Derek's cruelty was never just about his raging arrogance. It was a desperate, frantic cover-up. He had treated her like a worthless dependent because he was absolutely terrified she would discover he was a fraud. He isolated her in that basement studio, restricted her access to their joint checking accounts, and constantly belittled her intelligence because he needed her completely subjugated. If she had ever possessed the confidence to question his finances, his entire house of cards would have collapsed. He was not a tech visionary. He was a cornered animal frantically stealing money to maintain the illusion of success, projecting his own profound inadequacy onto the woman who actually owned the offshore firm, funding his pathetic charade. The irony was almost poetic. He had embezzled millions from his own wife, entirely unaware that she was the silent architect of his entire industry. The abuse was simply a smokescreen to hide his own catastrophic failure. Cassidy let out a slow, steady breath. The lingering sting of his insults completely vanished, replaced by a profound, icy clarity. She looked at Kendra, who was watching her closely, waiting for the verdict. Kendra turned off the tablet, letting the room plunge back into shadows. She walked over to Cassidy, her expression shifting to absolute predator. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. The numbers do not lie, and the evidence is entirely irrefutable. This is not just divorce anymore, Cassidy. It is a 20-year federal prison sentence. I compiled the forensic audit and drafted the legal brief. Shall I call the FBI right now? Cassidy turned back toward the window, looking out over the glittering city that now undeniably belonged to her. She thought about Derek scrambling for his corporate life, totally unaware of the trap closing around him. A small, dark smile crept across her face as she gave her answer. Not yet. Let him dress up for the gala first. The sprawling penthouse dressing suite of the Vanguard Tower became the staging ground for a total metamorphosis. For 2 years, Cassidy had meticulously maintained the facade of a struggling artist, burying her identity under oversized flannel shirts, scuffed boots, and paint-splattered overalls. She had dulled her shine to make Derek feel like the sun. Those days were officially dead. Standing in the center of the plush, mirror-lined room, Cassidy let the heavy, thrifted fabric slip from her shoulders and hit the floor. A team of 6 elite stylists flown in directly from Paris and Milan immediately swarmed her. They moved with silent, breathless efficiency. They pinned, tucked, and smoothed layers of midnight blue silk across her frame. The bespoke haute couture gown had been commissioned months ago, held in a climate-controlled vault, for the day she finally reclaimed her name. The fabric clung to her like liquid glass, the plunging neckline and daring slit exuding a raw, unapologetic power. Diamonds cold and heavy were fastened around her neck and wrists. Her messy bun was undone, her hair transformed into a sleek, cascading waterfall of dark waves. She stared at her reflection. The submissive, quiet wife who painted in a dusty basement was gone. The powerful woman looking back was a titan. The heavy double doors of the suite swung open. The stylists immediately stepped back, lowering their heads in respectful deference, as Jonathan Vanguard walked into the room. Cassidy's father was an imposing figure, a man who had built a global empire through sheer force of will. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his piercing gaze taking in the sight of his daughter. For years, they had engaged in a silent standoff over her social experiment with Derek. Jonathan had warned her that Derek was a parasite, but he had allowed her to learn the lesson on her own terms. He stopped a few feet away, his stern expression melting into a look of profound, overwhelming pride. He reached out, gently grasping her shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the silk of her gown. "You look exactly like your mother," Jonathan said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded absolute authority. Cassidy smiled, feeling a rare sting of tears behind her perfectly applied makeup. "You tried to see the good in a peasant's soul." "Cassidy." Jonathan continued, his grip tightening slightly as his tone shifted from paternal warmth to lethal corporate sharpness. "But a rat only knows how to steal. Crush him." He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a solid platinum keycard attached to a heavy silk lanyard. It was the master access pass to the entire Vanguard Holdings global network. The official CEO badge. He placed it carefully on the vanity table beside her diamond clutch. "The board has been notified," Jonathan stated, his eyes locking onto hers. "Tonight, you do not just attend the gala. Tonight, you take the throne." Across the city, far away from the glittering heights of the Vanguard penthouse, Derek Sterling was drowning in his own manufactured squalor. He stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of a dingy pawn shop in the garment district, the air thick with the smell of cheap cigars and desperation. His bank accounts remained completely frozen. His corporate credit lines were severed. He had exactly zero cash flow, and Sienna was demanding a lifestyle he could no longer subsidize. He needed to look like a wildly successful tech executive for the Vanguard Gala. He needed to project wealth to secure his job with the new CEO. But reality was suffocating him. He unclasped his prized Patek Philippe watch, his hands trembling as he slid the heavy gold timepiece across the scratched glass counter. It was the watch he had bought to celebrate his Series B funding, the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success. The pawnbroker picked it up, examining it through a jeweler's loupe with profound indifference. He offered Derek a fraction of its true value in crisp $100 bills. Derek snatched the cash, his jaw tight with humiliation. He immediately walked 2 blocks down the street to a budget formal wear rental shop. He slapped a portion of the cash on the counter to rent a tuxedo that smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals and desperation. He then marched to a street vendor, purchasing a cheap counterfeit Rolex to replace the masterpiece he had just pawned. He strapped the fake watch to his wrist, staring at the ticking second hand. He was a hollow shell, desperately trying to maintain an illusion that was already dead. He just needed to survive the night. He just needed to charm the Vanguard's CEO. Inside Derek's leased luxury apartment, Sienna was conducting her own preparations. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master bedroom, completely ignoring the mounting financial ruin crashing down around them. She had spent the last of her hidden cash reserves on professional hair and makeup. She slipped into the emerald silk gown she had forced Derek to buy before his accounts were locked. It fit perfectly, hugging her curves like a second skin. She reached into her velvet jewelry box and pulled out the heavy emerald necklace Derek had given her for the company holiday party. She fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, admiring the way the large green stones caught the light. She traced her fingers over the gems, completely unaware that Derek had secretly swapped the real diamonds and emeralds for worthless cubic zirconia and green glass. She adjusted the fake jewels, her smile sharp, calculating, and wildly delusional. She sprayed her favorite expensive perfume, inhaling the rich floral scent. Tonight was her ultimate audition. She was not going to let a pathetic bankrupt fraud like Derek ruin her future. She picked up her designer clutch, stepped into her stiletto heels, and walked out. She was absolutely ready to conquer the exclusive billionaires club. The penthouse dressing suite inside the Vanguard Tower transformed into a staging ground for absolute metamorphosis. For years, Cassidy meticulously maintained the exhausting facade of a struggling artist, bearing her identity under oversized flannel shirts and paint-splattered overalls. She dulled her own shine merely to make Derek feel like the sun. Those days were officially dead. Standing firmly in the center of the plush, mirror-lined room, Cassidy let the heavy, thrifted fabric slip from her shoulders. A team of 6 elite stylists swarmed her immediately. They moved with silent, breathless efficiency, pinning and smoothing layers of midnight blue silk across her frame. The bespoke haute couture gown had been commissioned months ago, held safely inside a climate-controlled vault for the day she finally reclaimed her name. The fabric clung to her like liquid glass, exuding raw, unapologetic power. Cold, heavy diamonds were fastened tightly around her neck and wrists. Her messy bun was entirely undone, her hair transformed into a sleek, cascading waterfall of dark waves. She stared fiercely at her stunning reflection. The submissive, quiet wife who painted in a dusty basement was totally gone. The powerful woman looking back was finally a true titan today. The heavy double doors of the suite swung open. The stylists immediately stepped back, lowering their heads in respectful deference as Jonathan Vanguard walked into the room. Cassidy's father was an imposing figure, a man who had built a global empire through sheer force of will. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He stopped a few feet away, his stern expression melting into a look of profound, overwhelming pride. He reached out gently, grasping her shoulders. "You look exactly like your mother," Jonathan said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "You tried to see the good in a peasant's soul, Cassidy, but a rat only knows how to steal. Crush him." He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and withdrew a solid platinum keycard attached to a heavy silk lanyard. It was the master access pass to the entire Vanguard Holdings global network. The official Vanguard Holdings CEO badge. He placed it carefully on the vanity table beside her clutch. "The board has been notified," Jonathan stated, his eyes locking onto hers. "Tonight you do not just attend the gala, tonight you absolutely take the powerful throne back completely right now today." Across the city, far away from the glittering heights of the Vanguard penthouse, Derek Sterling was drowning in manufactured squalor. He stood under the flickering fluorescent lights of a dingy pawn shop, the air thick with desperation. His bank accounts remained completely frozen. His corporate credit lines were severed. He desperately needed to look like a wildly successful executive for the gala. He unclasped his prized Patek Philippe watch, his hands trembling as he slid the heavy gold timepiece across the scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker offered him a pathetic fraction of its true value in crisp bills. Derek snatched the cash, his jaw tight with pure humiliation. He immediately walked 2 blocks to a budget formal wear shop, slapping the cash down to rent a cheap tuxedo. He then purchased a fake Rolex to replace his masterpiece. He was a hollow shell maintaining a dead illusion. Meanwhile, inside Derek's apartment, Sienna was conducting her own preparations. She slipped into the emerald gown and put on the stolen emerald necklace, admiring her reflection. She traced her fingers over the fake gems, entirely ready to conquer the billionaires' club, totally unaware her shiny jewels were just worthless pieces of green glass today. Friday evening, the Vanguard Gala pulsed with extreme wealth. Flashbulbs exploded against the velvet ropes. Derek and Sienna arrived in a rented limousine. They marched toward the grand entrance, their entitlement masking profound desperation. A young attendant politely asked for their credentials. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Derek snapped, actively mocking the working-class event staff. "I am attending as a guest of the CEO." The attendant, unimpressed, gestured them through. Sienna let out a haughty laugh. "They let any peasant wear a uniform," she drawled, showing her ugly colors. Inside the grand ballroom, Derek found his name on the seating chart. He was assigned to the darkest corner by the catering kitchen. Sienna gasped in horror. "Fix this right now," she hissed. Derek approached a massive security guard, discreetly sliding his last remaining cash into the man's palm. "There has been an error," Derek said smoothly. "Mr. Sterling belongs at table 4. The guard looked at the money, then looked at Derek's cheap tuxedo, his eyes flashing with amusement. He silently unhooked the velvet rope, allowing Derek and Sienna to slip into the exclusive section. Securing their prime real estate, Derek immediately launched his aggressive networking campaign. He grabbed 2 champagne flutes and dragged Sienna toward a dense cluster of older men wearing bespoke suits here today. "Derek Sterling," he announced. "Vanguard just bought us out. I am stepping in as the CEO's new right-hand man." The billionaire slowly accepted the handshake. His gaze slid over Derek with clinical precision, noticing the poorly fitted jacket, the painfully fake watch, and the desperate sweat. He then looked at Sienna, his eyes lingering on the heavy emerald necklace. The billionaire's wife covered her mouth to hide an amused smile, instantly recognizing the worthless cubic zirconia. "Well," the billionaire replied, dripping with polite pity, "that is quite the upward trajectory. We look forward to seeing your performance unfold." The surrounding executives exchanged knowing, silent glances, clearly recognizing a dead man walking. Derek, completely oblivious to their mockery, puffed his chest and dragged Sienna toward the next group of wealthy investors. Suddenly, the ambient chatter inside the massive ballroom hushed. The glaring overhead lights slowly dimmed, plunging the outer edges of the elegant room into complete darkness. Brilliant spotlights rapidly converged on the grand stage. The vast room was so entirely silent, a single pin drop echoed. The MC steps directly up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chairman of Vanguard Holdings and our newly appointed CEO." Jonathan Vanguard emerged from the shadows at the edge of the stage, striding into the glaring white spotlights with the effortless authority of a reigning monarch. The scattered applause quickly swelled into a deafening roar, echoing off the ceiling. He approached the lucite podium, resting his hands firmly on the edges, and surveyed the sea of Chicago's ultra-elite. He did not ask for silence. He simply waited for it. Within seconds, the room fell entirely quiet, the attendees leaning forward in breathless anticipation. Down on the floor, Derek pushed his way toward the front, pulling a reluctant Sienna behind him. He needed the new chairman to see his face. "Thank you for gathering tonight," Jonathan began, his deep voice filling the cavernous space. "We stand at the precipice of a massive technological shift. Vanguard Holdings has always been a titan navigating markets with ruthless precision, But true power requires evolution. It requires identifying the weak, purging the inefficient, and acquiring assets that shape the future. This week, Vanguard initiated a corporate purge of the Chicago Tech Initiative. We liquidated bloated startups, severed incompetent executives, and secured vital intellectual property that will drive our next decade of growth. Derek puffed out his chest, convinced Jonathan was validating his personal genius. But a corporate empire is only as strong as the bloodline that sustains it. Jonathan continued, his tone shifting from clinical business to something personal. For 40 years, I have built Vanguard Holdings with my bare hands. I have crushed competitors and amassed wealth. However, legacy is not defined by what you build. Legacy is defined by who you trust to protect it. I have spent the last 2 years testing the waters, allowing the next generation to observe the market from the ground floor. I wanted to see if they possess the absolute ruthlessness required to manage billions. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. Derek frowned, his manufactured smile faltering slightly. The tone of the speech felt unusually aggressive for a standard corporate gala. Jonathan raised his hand, instantly silencing the whispers. I am stepping down tonight to pass the torch to my daughter, the sole owner of Vanguard Holdings, and the new owner of the Chicago Tech Initiative. She is the brilliant mind who personally orchestrated the hostile takeover of your firms. Effective immediately, she has absolute authority over every subsidiary and is the new sovereign of this entire empire. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. A female CEO taking over the Vanguard Empire was unprecedented. Derek felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had prepared an entire pitch geared toward a male executive. He began recalibrating his networking strategy, trying to figure out how to charm a powerful heiress. Sienna suddenly perked up, her predatory instincts momentarily confused by the introduction of a female billionaire. Jonathan turned away from the podium and extended his arm toward the sweeping marble staircase located at the center of the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan declared, please welcome the CEO. The stage lights immediately blacked out. A brilliant, concentrated spotlight ignited, hitting the top landing of the grand staircase. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and a figure stepped out into the blinding glow. The entire ballroom collectively stopped breathing. She did not walk. She glided. She descended the marble steps with the terrifying grace of a predator entering a cage of cornered prey. She wore a midnight blue, haute couture gown that clung to her frame like liquid glass, the deep silk shimmering violently under the intense lights. A cascade of dark, glossy waves framed her face. Around her neck rested a stunning array of flawless, perfectly cut diamonds that caught the spotlight and threw fractured rainbows across the dark room. These were not laboratory-created fakes. They were genuine, priceless stones, radiating unimaginable wealth. But it was not the gown or the diamonds that commanded the absolute submission of the room. It was her eyes. They were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of mercy. She radiated a suffocating aura of absolute power. She was no longer the quiet, submissive wife shrinking in the shadows. She looked like an absolute queen returning to claim a stolen kingdom. Down in the crowd, wedged between a group of confused tech investors, Derek stood frozen. His brain violently rejected the visual information his eyes were processing. He blinked, shaking his head, convinced the cheap rented tuxedo was cutting off circulation to his brain. He stared at the woman descending the stairs, his mind desperately trying to categorize her. The face was identical. The bone structure was exact. But the energy, the wealth, the sheer terrifying dominance was entirely alien. He took a staggering step back, bumping a waiter. It was Cassidy. His broke wife was standing at the absolute pinnacle of global wealth. The horrific reality crashed down upon him like a concrete vault. Cassidy was not a struggling artist. She was a vanguard. She was the billionaire who just orchestrated the hostile takeover of his company. She was the phantom entity who froze his bank accounts, seized his encrypted laptop, and possessed the absolute proof of his federal wire fraud. The rented champagne flute slipped from his trembling, sweaty hand. It hit the polished marble floor, shattering loudly. The sharp sound echoed through the silent, captivated crowd like a gunshot. The cheap glass fragmented into 100 pieces. Beside him, Sienna whipped her head around, glaring at Derek for causing a scene. She opened her mouth to hiss a reprimand when her gaze caught the woman on the stairs. Sienna stopped breathing entirely. Her hand flew to her chest, clutching the heavy green stones resting against her collarbone. She stared at Cassidy dripping in genuine priceless diamonds, and then looked down at Derek. He was trembling in a rented suit with a fake Rolex on his wrist. The brutal truth materialized instantly. Sienna realized she had anchored herself to a destitute fraud while the real billionaire entered the room. Cassidy reached the bottom of the sweeping marble staircase. The deafening applause from Chicago's ultra-elite washed over her like a physical wave. Billionaires, venture capitalists, and industry titans parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, unobstructed path for her to walk. She moved with a predatory elegance she had kept buried for years. Every step was deliberate, every breath calculated. The heavy midnight blue silk of her haute couture gown trailed behind her, whispering against the polished floor. She ascended the short flight of stairs to the illuminated main stage. Jonathan Vanguard stood by the lucite podium, his eyes gleaming with a lethal, approving pride. He stepped aside, presenting his daughter to the global financial empire he had built. He handed her the sleek silver microphone. The transfer of power was absolute. Cassidy wrapped her fingers around the cool metal. She turned to face the vast ballroom. The applause immediately ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and absolutely electric. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the world held their breath waiting for her command. Cassidy let her gaze sweep across the sea of faces, projecting absolute authority. She did not rush. She let the silence stretch, forcing the room to submit to her pacing. Finally, her eyes locked onto a specific target in the front row. Derek stood frozen, his face drained of all color, sweating profusely inside his cheap rented tuxedo. The fake Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked like an anchor, dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. Beside him, Sienna was actively inching away, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic, desperate to distance herself from the sinking ship. Cassidy held Derek's terrified stare. She did not show an ounce of anger or betrayal. She showed nothing but the cold, clinical detachment of a monarch surveying a diseased insect. "Before we celebrate this new era for Vanguard Holdings," Cassidy said, her voice smooth, amplified, and ringing with absolute clarity across the cavernous space, "I must attend to my first official executive duty as your new Chief Executive Officer. We have a rat in the house." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the front rows. High society galas were usually defined by polite corporate doublespeak and passive-aggressive networking. Public executions were extraordinarily rare. The elite crowd leaned in, their predatory instincts fully activated, eager for the blood in the water. Derek swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. He tried to break eye contact to look anywhere else, but Cassidy's gaze pinned him firmly to the floor. He was entirely trapped. "Derek Sterling," Cassidy announced, her tone devoid of any emotional inflection. She spoke his name the way a surgeon might identify a malignant tumor. "You currently hold the title of Head of Development at Neural Net Solutions, a subsidiary now entirely owned and operated by the Chicago Tech Initiative under Vanguard Holdings. You are hereby terminated from your position for gross misconduct, effective immediately." The words struck like physical blows. The surrounding executives, the very men Derek had been arrogantly trying to impress just minutes prior, immediately took a collective step back. They looked at him with a mixture of disgust and dark amusement. In their world, being publicly fired by a Vanguard at the annual gala was the ultimate death sentence. It was a total professional excommunication. No firm would ever hire him. No bank would ever back him. He was a corporate leper. Derek felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The humiliation was burning him alive. His monumental ego, the inflated sense of superiority that had driven his every action for years, violently rejected the reality of the situation. He could not accept being discarded like trash in front of the city's billionaires. He could not accept being crushed by the woman he had treated like a subservient peasant. The sheer embarrassment mutated instantly into a blind, reckless rage. "This is a lie," Derek shouted, his voice cracking loudly as it echoed through the silent ballroom. He stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger up at the stage. "This is a pathetic personal vendetta. She is my wife, my bitter, jealous wife. She is just angry because I left her, because I found someone better. Do not listen to her. She is using this company to settle a domestic dispute. She knows I am the only reason Neural Net Solutions has any value. I built that code. I secured that funding. She is trying to steal my life's work out of pure spite. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms, desperately appealing to the businessmen surrounding him. She is completely unqualified to run this empire, he pleaded, his voice dripping with desperation. Look at her. She paints in a basement. She knows absolutely nothing about tech or corporate finance. This is a hostile takeover driven by female hysteria. I demand to speak to the board of directors. I demand a proper hearing. The crowd stared at him in horrified fascination. No one moved to support him. Sienna had already retreated into the shadows, furiously pulling the fake emerald necklace from her throat and shoving it into her clutch, desperate to avoid the fallout. On the stage, Cassidy did not flinch. She did not interrupt his pathetic flailing tantrum. She simply let him dig his own grave, allowing everyone in the room to witness his complete unraveling. When Derek finally ran out of breath, panting heavily under the harsh glare of the stage lights, Cassidy offered a slow, chilling smile. A personal vendetta. Cassidy echoed, her voice echoing smoothly through the speakers. How incredibly predictable. You always did mistake your own arrogance for intelligence, Derek. But I do not deal in domestic disputes. I deal in forensic accounting. Cassidy slowly raised her right hand, her fingers perfectly poised in the cold air. She looked down at him, her eyes gleaming with absolute unyielding ruin. Roll the screens, Cassidy commanded softly, snapping her fingers sharply. The massive LED screens spanning the entire back wall of the grand stage flashed to life with blinding, synchronized brilliance. The sudden explosion of stark white light cast long, dramatic shadows across the terrified faces of the elite crowd. For a fleeting second, the display was entirely blank, building an agonizing tension that squeezed the breathable air from the room. Then the high-definition images materialized. The sheer scale of the projection made the evidence absolutely impossible to ignore, towering 30 feet above the ballroom floor. A meticulously organized cascade of total financial devastation immediately filled the newly illuminated screens. The first slide displayed a highly complex web of offshore bank transfers. Red arrows boldly traced the illicit flow of capital directly from Neural Net Solutions' corporate accounts into a series of hidden shell companies registered under Derek Sterling in the Cayman Islands. Next came the forged signatures. High-resolution scans magnified the fraudulent documents, placing the authentic signatures of Vanguard executives right next to his very clumsy, desperate forgeries. The visual comparison was absolutely damning. The discrepancies were highlighted in bright clinical yellow, exposing a long trail of unauthorized loans, illegal asset liquidations, and severe corporate banking violations displayed tonight. Cassidy paced the stage with measured predatory steps, the midnight blue silk of her gown sweeping across the floor. She did not need to raise her voice. The microphone carried her calm, lethal cadence perfectly. You claimed you built value, Derek, Cassidy said, her tone dripping with surgical precision. But true value requires innovation. You lack the intellect for innovation, so you resorted to theft. These documents represent 42 separate counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. You did not build Neural Net Solutions. You simply drained it to fund an illusion of success you could not achieve. The next slide hit the massive screens with a heavy digital thud. It was a series of fraudulent tax returns cross-referenced with the actual depleted corporate ledger. The numbers were staggering. Derek had systematically siphoned millions, hiding the deficit behind fabricated revenue projections. The Chicago billionaires, the very men Derek had been eagerly pitching moments ago, stared at the towering evidence in profound disgust. The silence in the ballroom morphed into a venomous, buzzing hive of whispered mockery. Investors leaned away from Derek as if his sudden disgrace was highly contagious. The sharp, polished society of Vanguard Holdings watched. They operated on a strict code of financial ruthlessness, but they absolutely despised a sloppy, incompetent thief. Derek was experiencing a total, catastrophic systems failure. His mouth opened and closed, grasping for air that refused to reach his lungs. He looked like a fish thrown violently onto dry land. The carefully constructed armor of his fake billionaire persona disintegrated into ash. The executives who had offered him polite, pitying smiles just 10 minutes prior were now openly sneering. Cellular phones were already emerging from tuxedo pockets. Text messages flew across the ballroom, ensuring his professional excommunication was permanently sealed tonight. He was entirely incinerated. No venture capital firm would ever take his calls. No tech incubator would allow him through their lobby doors. He was a walking liability, a convicted fraudster standing dead center in a room of apex predators. You thought you could outsmart Vanguard Holdings? Cassidy continued, stopping directly at the edge of the stage, towering over his pathetic frame. You thought you could mask your incompetence with stolen capital. But my family does not just audit ledgers. We audit lives. And your life, Derek, is nothing but a poorly executed forgery of a truly successful man today. Cassidy tapped the microphone once. The screens shifted abruptly, transitioning to the final, most devastating slide of the evening. The financial spreadsheets vanished, replaced by a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph of a receipt from an exclusive diamond broker in Geneva. The date was prominently circled. The purchase price was highlighted in blinding red. Beside the receipt, a photograph of the item appeared. It was a massive custom-designed emerald and diamond necklace. The text below the image clearly stated the purchase was funded entirely by a direct wire transfer from the stolen neural net corporate accounts. The entire room erupted. Gasps echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of heads swiveled with brutal, synchronized speed, their eyes tracking from the towering projection down to the dark corner of the VIP section. The spotlight operators, anticipating the moment, perfectly swung a blinding beam of light directly onto Sienna. She stood frozen, pinned against the velvet ropes. The harsh spotlight illuminated every facet of her trembling body. It highlighted her rented silk dress. It highlighted her terrified wide eyes. And most importantly, it highlighted the heavy, glittering emerald necklace resting prominently against her collarbone. The identical necklace currently projected 30 feet above her. She was wearing stolen corporate property. Sienna felt the collective judging weight of 100 billionaires pressing down on her lungs. The mocking laughter began to ripple through the crowd. Elegant women behind fans pointed directly at her chest. Powerful men scoffed openly at the pathetic display. She was standing in the most exclusive room in Chicago, surrounded by the untouchable elite she had desperately sought to conquer, wearing a neon sign that branded her a common thief. The realization hit Sienna with the force of a speeding train. The jewels she had flaunted were actually federal evidence right now. She was an accessory to grand larceny. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized her mind. Her breathing turned ragged. She looked at the smirking faces of the elite, then looked at Derek. He was staring blankly at the stage, totally unresponsive, entirely broken. The man she thought was her golden ticket to high society was actually a bankrupt criminal who had just turned her into a public accessory to federal wire fraud. Her dark eyes narrowed into slits of pure, venomous hatred. Her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. She stepped directly toward Derek, the facade evaporating instantly tonight. Sienna lunged at the heavy emerald necklace weighing down her chest. The cold metal clasp dug into her skin as her manicured fingers clawed frantically at the back of her neck. Panic entirely erased her carefully practiced elegance. She yanked the jewelry forward with terrifying force. The thick chain snapped loudly. The jagged metal tore a harsh bleeding scratch across her collarbone, leaving a bright red line against her pale skin. She did not care about the pain. She only cared about survival. She raised her arm and hurled the massive piece of evidence directly at Derek's chest right now. "I did not know," Sienna screamed, her shrill voice echoing through the stunned ballroom. She spun around wildly, addressing the circle of billionaires and executives who were watching her like a specimen under a microscope. "He lied to me. He told me he was a highly successful CEO. He bought this for me and forced me to wear it. I had absolutely no idea it was stolen. I am a victim here." She pointed an accusing finger at Derek, her face contorted with desperate self-preservation today. "He is a fraud," she yelled. "He manipulated me. I swear I have nothing to do with his pathetic corporate crimes." The crowd recoiled from her hysterical outburst, their expressions shifting rapidly from amusement to utter disgust. The wealthy elite despised a thief, but they held a very special contempt for a treacherous parasite. Sienna realized her loud screams were doing absolutely nothing to win their sympathy. She was permanently branded as an accomplice. She stumbled backward, desperately trying to melt into the dark shadows, abandoning the man she had planned to ride to the absolute top immediately right now. Derek barely registered the sharp sting of the heavy necklace striking his chest. He did not hear Sienna's shrill betrayal or notice her frantic retreat into the crowd. The ambient noise of the ballroom faded into a dull, rushing roar inside his ears. The gravity of his total annihilation finally crushed his legs. His knees buckled abruptly. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor, landing painfully amidst the scattered shards of his broken champagne flute. The expensive fabric of his rented tuxedo soaked up the spilled alcohol. He was entirely stripped of his pride, his stolen wealth, and identity today. He looked up at the illuminated stage, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. Cassidy stood above him, like a vengeful deity, her diamond-draped silhouette framed by the colossal screens displaying his federal crimes. His mind, severely fractured by the sudden trauma of public execution, desperately reached for the only lifeline he had left. He ignored the mocking whispers and the glaring spotlights. He placed his trembling hands flat on the polished marble and began to crawl. He dragged his knees across the hard floor, completely ignoring the tiny shards of glass slicing deeply into his cheap rented trousers immediately. He hauled his pathetic frame toward the edge of the grand stage, leaving a faint trail of spilled champagne behind him. "Cassidy, baby, please!" Derek wailed, his voice a grotesque sobbing plea that carried clearly through the entire ballroom. Heavy tears streamed down his pale, sweating face, entirely ruining the illusion of the stoic tech visionary. "You cannot do this to me. We are married. We took sacred vows together." He reached the base of the tall stage, grasping desperately at the edge of the polished platform. He craned his neck upward, his face a mask of pure terror today. "What is yours is mine, Cassidy. We are a team. I was just trying to build our future. I did it for us. We can fix this together. I love you. Please, baby, just tell them to stop. Tell the board to drop the audit. I am your husband. You have to protect me." The sheer audacity of his begging sent a collective shockwave through the elite audience. The executives stared in stunned revulsion at the broken man sobbing at the feet of the Vanguard CEO. He was invoking the sacred bond of marriage to escape federal prison right now. He expected her to save him after treating her like a worthless servant for years. Up on the massive stage, Cassidy looked down at him. Her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of absolute power. She did not sneer. She did not yell. She simply tilted her head, observing his frantic, pathetic groveling with mild clinical curiosity. She watched the man who had stolen her artwork, mocked her intelligence, and funded his mistress with her money, currently crying like a cornered animal. She slowly raised the silver microphone to her painted lips, preparing to deliver the final killing blow immediately. Before she could speak a single word, a thunderous noise shattered the intense tension inside the room. The massive solid oak double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom burst open with explosive force. The heavy wood crashed violently against the surrounding marble walls. The sudden impact drew every single eye away from the pathetic scene happening at the stage. A highly organized squad of heavily armed men marched aggressively into the grand ballroom. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, cutting a very direct path straight through the massive sea of completely shocked billionaires standing around the floor. They wore dark tactical windbreakers. Heavy golden badges gleamed brightly on their wide chests under the opulent crystal chandeliers. The soft orchestral music completely died. The frantic whispers instantly ceased. The federal agents did not pause to admire the bespoke Italian suits or the beautiful haute couture gowns. They kept their cold eyes locked entirely on the sobbing man kneeling directly at the front of the room. The lead agent stopped a few feet behind Derek. He reached down, grabbing Derek by the shoulder of his rented tuxedo. He hoisted him up, fully ready to drag him away right now. The lead agent violently jerked Derek backward. The sudden force lifted the sobbing man completely off the marble floor. Derek flailed his arms helplessly, but a second agent seamlessly grabbed his wrists, twisting them behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped shut around his trembling wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly over the absolute silence of the Vanguard gala. Derek gasped, his knees buckling again, but the highly trained agents held him firmly upright. Special Agent Kendra Vance emerged from the dense formation of dark windbreakers. She walked down the center aisle with the fierce, unwavering authority of a woman who had spent grueling months meticulously building a watertight federal case. Kendra stepped directly into his line of sight, holding up a thick stack of warrants. She did not raise her voice, but her words sliced through the cavernous ballroom with devastating clarity. Derek Sterling, Kendra stated calmly, her sharp eyes locked onto his terrified face. You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. Derek stared at the federal badges flashing under the crystal chandeliers. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his clammy skin an ashen, sickly gray. The harsh reality of his situation finally breached the massive fortified walls of his monumental ego. This was not a simple corporate dispute. This was not a tense boardroom negotiation where he could leverage his false charisma. This was federal prison. The heavy, suffocating weight of decades behind bars instantly crushed the last pitiful remnants of his fake billionaire persona. He whimpered softly, a completely pathetic sound totally devoid of dignity. While the agents secured Derek, the wealthy crowd's attention remained fiercely divided. Near the velvet VIP ropes, Sienna was desperately calculating her escape route. The blinding security spotlight had finally moved away from her, shifting back to the main stage. She saw her small window of opportunity. She forcefully kicked off her expensive borrowed stiletto heels, abandoning them on the polished marble floor. Clutching the hem of her torn silk dress, she ducked her head and sprinted quickly toward the ornate side exit doors leading to the kitchen corridors. She genuinely thought she was invisible. She fully believed she could slip away into the cold Chicago night and reinvent herself again. She was entirely wrong. Before Sienna could push the heavy brass handle of the side door, a tall female agent stepped out from the dark shadows of the catering hallway. The agent moved with terrifying, explosive speed. She lunged forward, grabbing Sienna roughly by the shoulder and spinning her around violently. Sienna gasped loudly, trying to wrench herself free, but the federal agent's strong grip was like an iron vice clamping down on her delicate collarbone. "Let go of me!" Sienna shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "I told them I did not know anything. I am a victim. He manipulated me." The stern female agent did not flinch or offer any sympathy. She slammed Sienna firmly against the heavy wooden doors, swiftly pulling her fragile arms securely behind her back. The sharp, unmistakable click of a second pair of steel handcuffs resonated through the quiet side aisle. Sienna Sterling, the agent, announced loudly, ensuring the nearby terrified executives heard every single word clearly. "You are under arrest as an accessory to fraud and possession of stolen property." The Fragile Innocent Victim Act evaporated instantly. Her panic rapidly mutated into pure, feral rage. She began shrieking hysterically, kicking her bare feet wildly against the agent's shins. She twisted her body aggressively, trying to bite the strong hands securing her wrists. She spat vicious curses, screaming vile obscenities that made the surrounding high society guests physically recoil in absolute horror. Her carefully cultivated elegance was completely gone, forever, entirely replaced by the desperate thrashing reality of a cornered common criminal. Two additional agents rushed over to subdue her, practically lifting her completely off the ground as she continued to thrash and loudly cry. On the illuminated main stage, Cassidy watched the synchronized federal takedown with absolute chilling calm. She did not smile. She did not gloat or cheer. She simply stood perfectly still at the lucite podium, a powerful monarch, observing the necessary removal of toxic pests from her global empire. Her father, Jonathan Vanguard, stood quietly in the dark wings, nodding his silent, profound approval. The transfer of power was indeed absolute tonight, and Cassidy had just successfully proven she possessed the exact ruthlessness required to fiercely protect the Vanguard legacy. The agents surrounding Derek turned him forcefully toward the grand main entrance. The Chicago elite parted again, creating a very wide, unobstructed path for the humiliating federal perp walk. They watched with dark, morbid fascination as the arrogant man who had aggressively demanded their investments was paraded out in tight steel cuffs. It was the ultimate inescapable social execution. As the grim agents dragged him down the long, sweeping center aisle, Derek desperately twisted his neck violently, fighting against their firm, unyielding grip. He locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes directly onto Cassidy standing high above him on the brightly illuminated stage. His broken mind, fully shattered by the sheer magnitude of his total defeat, latched onto a final, pathetic, delusional hope. He refused to accept that she held all the ultimate power. He stubbornly refused to accept that he had permanently lost absolutely everything today. "You cannot do this!" Derek screamed frantically, his vocal cords tearing as he thrashed wildly against the federal agents holding him. The sound was raw, echoing off the high marble walls. "You are my wife. By law, you have to pay my bail and share your assets." Cassidy did not respond to his utterly pathetic, desperate demands. She simply stared down from her powerful, elevated position, her expression completely unbothered by his dramatic removal. As the heavy wooden doors finally slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate forever, she slowly turned to face her completely captivated audience. The lead agent violently jerked Derek backward. The sudden force lifted the sobbing man completely off the marble floor. Derek flailed his arms helplessly, but a second agent seamlessly grabbed his wrists, twisting them behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped shut around his trembling wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly over the absolute silence of the Vanguard Gala. Derek gasped, his knees buckling again, but the highly trained federal agents held him firmly upright. Special Agent Kendra Vance emerged from the dense formation of dark windbreakers. She walked straight down the center aisle with the fierce, unwavering authority of a woman who had spent grueling months meticulously building a watertight federal case. Kendra stepped directly into his line of sight, holding up a thick stack of warrants. She did not raise her voice, but her words sliced through the cavernous ballroom with devastating clarity. "Derek Sterling," Kendra stated calmly, her sharp eyes locked onto his terrified face. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Derek stared at the federal badges flashing brightly under the crystal chandeliers. The remaining blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his clammy skin an ashen, sickly gray. The harsh reality of his situation finally breached the massive walls of his monumental ego. This was not a tense boardroom negotiation where he could leverage his false charisma. This was federal prison. The suffocating weight of decades behind bars instantly crushed the last pitiful remnants of his fake billionaire persona. He whimpered softly, completely devoid of any dignity. Near the velvet VIP ropes, Sienna was desperately calculating her escape route. The blinding security spotlight had finally shifted back to the main stage. She saw her small window of opportunity. She forcefully kicked off her expensive borrowed stiletto heels, abandoning them on the polished marble floor. Clutching the hem of her torn silk dress, she ducked her head and sprinted quickly toward the ornate side exit doors leading to the kitchen corridors. She genuinely thought she was invisible. She fully believed she could slip away into the cold Chicago night and reinvent herself. Before Sienna could push the heavy brass handle of the side door, a tall female agent stepped out from the dark shadows of the catering hallway. She lunged forward, grabbing Sienna roughly by the shoulder and spinning her around violently. Sienna gasped loudly, trying to wrench herself free, but the federal agent's strong grip was like an iron vice clamping down on her delicate collarbone. "You're under arrest as an accessory to fraud and possession of stolen property," the agent announced loudly, ensuring the nearby executives heard every single word clearly. "I didn't know. He lied to me. He told me he was rich. He forced me to wear this." Sienna shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic as she threw Derek completely under the bus to save herself. The Fragile Innocent Victim Act evaporated instantly. Her panic rapidly mutated into pure feral rage. She began shrieking hysterically, kicking her bare feet wildly against the agent's shins. She twisted her body aggressively, trying to bite the strong hands securing her wrists. She spat vicious curses, screaming vile obscenities that made the surrounding high society guests physically recoil in absolute horror. Her carefully cultivated elegance was completely gone, forever replaced by the desperate, thrashing reality of a cornered common criminal. Two additional agents rushed over to subdue her, practically lifting her completely off the ground as she continued to thrash and loudly cry. The stern agent surrounding Derek turned him forcefully toward the grand main entrance. The Chicago elite parted again, creating a very wide, unobstructed path for the humiliating federal perp walk. They watched with dark, morbid fascination as the arrogant man who had aggressively demanded their investments was paraded out in tight steel cuffs. As the grim agents dragged him down the long, sweeping center aisle, Derek desperately twisted his neck violently, fighting against their firm, unyielding grip. He locked his crazed, bloodshot eyes directly onto Cassidy standing high above him on the brightly illuminated stage. His broken mind, completely shattered by the sheer magnitude of his total defeat, latched onto a final pathetic delusional hope. He stubbornly refused to accept that he had permanently lost absolutely everything today. "You can't do this. You're my wife. By law, you have to pay my bail and share your assets." Derek screamed frantically, his vocal cords tearing as he thrashed wildly against the federal agents holding him. Kendra stepped out from the dark shadows of the stage, positioned right beside Cassidy, holding up a pristine white document. She moved with elegant, predatory grace. The crisp official paper caught the bright stage lights, reflecting a blinding, undeniable truth. She reached over and calmly took the sleek silver microphone directly from Cassidy's hand. "Actually, Derek," Kendra announces into the microphone, her voice echoing through the hall. "Remember that zero-asset split agreement you were so eager to sign? The judge expedited it. Your divorce was finalized at 9 a.m. this morning." Derek stopped fighting. His entire body went completely rigid. The devastating words hung in the silent air, slowly penetrating his panicked mind. The impenetrable, ironclad legal trap had officially snapped shut. He had willingly signed away his only legal connection to the Vanguard fortune. He had eagerly handed them the exact weapon they needed to completely sever him from their vast empire. There was no marital safety net. There was absolutely no protection left. Kendra smiles her most lethal corporate smile. "My client is a legally single billionaire. You are a broke, unemployed felon. Have fun in federal prison." Derek collapsed internally. The sheer, overwhelming totality of his destruction crushed him. He threw his head back and unleashed a long, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated agony. The sound was horrifying, a visceral expression of absolute realization and endless despair. Derek's screams of pure agony and realization echo through the hall as the police drag him and Sienna out into the cold Chicago night. The heavy oak doors burst open one final time, violently pulling the two broken criminals outside. The massive ballroom remained completely silent for one breathless second. The crowd erupts into thunderous applause. The thunderous applause washed over Cassidy like a warm, cleansing wave. She did not bow. She simply offered a single resolute nod to the Chicago elite before gracefully descending the stage steps. Her father met her at the bottom, his eyes shining with undeniable pride. The storm had finally broken. The rot had been completely excised from their empire. 2 weeks later, the swift and brutal reality of the justice system had fully settled over the criminals who thought they could outsmart her. The fallout was absolute, leaving no corner of their miserable lives untouched by severe, unyielding consequence. Derek Sterling sat shivering on a rigid steel cot inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The vibrant orange fabric of his standard-issue jumpsuit chafed against his skin, a harsh daily reminder of his new, inescapable reality. His high-priced defense attorney had completely failed him at the arraignment. The federal judge, citing his hidden offshore shell companies and the severity of his financial crimes, had immediately declared him a massive flight risk. Bail was vehemently denied without a second thought. The man who had spent years obsessively curating a fraudulent image of supreme wealth was now entirely stripped of his agency and forced into total submission. He stared down at the dented aluminum tray resting on his lap. It held a gelatinous scoop of gray mystery meat, soggy canned green beans, and a slice of dry, crumbling bread. He picked up his flimsy plastic spork, his hands trembling violently. The stark contrast between this miserable, tasteless meal and the Michelin-starred dinners he used to demand on Cassidy's credit card broke whatever fragile resolve he had left. Derek dropped the spork onto the floor. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands and began to weep. Deep, ugly sobs echoed off the cold cinder block walls of his tiny claustrophobic cell. He had traded a beautiful life of quiet luxury for absolute ruin, driven entirely by his own bottomless greed and monumental arrogance. There were no venture capitalists here to manipulate. There was no subservient wife to degrade. There was only the sterile hum of the prison ventilation system and the terrifying certainty of a very long federal sentence. Miles away in a quiet Connecticut suburb, a distinctly different kind of public execution was taking place. The federal authorities had quickly traced the illicit funds Derek used to secure his parents' lavish, highly fabricated lifestyle. The grand colonial house they had proudly flaunted to their country club friends was officially seized under strict federal asset forfeiture laws. Frank and Martha Sterling were unceremoniously evicted from the premises. They stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk, thoroughly disgraced in broad daylight. There were no moving trucks hired to help them. They had been given exactly 30 minutes by the armed marshals to gather whatever personal items they could physically carry. Martha struggled to drag a cheap, heavy black trash bag across the manicured lawn. The thin plastic caught on a thorny rosebush, tearing wide open and spilling her counterfeit designer shoes directly onto the damp dirt. Frank did not offer to help her pick them up. He stood by their rusted sedan, his face purple with rage, furiously pointing a judging finger at his wife. He bitterly blamed her for raising a thief. She screamed back loudly, blaming his endless toxic demands for unearned status and wealth for pushing their only son straight into federal fraud. Their neighbors, the very people they had arrogantly looked down upon for years, watched the pathetic spectacle from their spacious front porches. They did not offer any assistance. They simply whispered and pointed, fully enjoying the spectacular downfall of the neighborhood bullies. The Sterlings had enabled their son's profound cruelty, happily feasting on the spoils of his theft, and now they were left with absolutely nothing but bitter resentment and a trunk full of cheap garbage bags. Meanwhile, Sienna was experiencing her own personal hell inside the Cook County Women's Facility. The federal prosecutors had eagerly indicted her as a willing accessory to grand larceny. While awaiting her trial, she had been aggressively stripped of her expensive silk dresses and forced into a scratchy, unflattering khaki uniform. Her assigned daily labor was a direct punishing assault on her intense vanity. She stood over a massive, steaming industrial sink in the crowded prison kitchen. The humid air was thick with the suffocating stench of boiled cabbage and old rancid grease. She plunged her bare hands into the scalding soapy water, furiously scrubbing a heavy cast-iron pot. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails had chipped and broken off days ago. Her skin was raw red and actively peeling from the harsh chemical detergents used to clean the metal. Sweat dripped down her forehead, ruining the flawless complexion she had successfully weaponized for years. She scrubbed harder, her inner frustration finally boiling over. The heavy pot slipped from her weakened grip, crashing loudly against the metal basin and splashing dirty, greasy water directly into her face. She snapped. She threw the abrasive sponge violently against the tile wall and unleashed a piercing, hysterical shriek. She turned and screamed viciously at the supervising guard, demanding special treatment, demanding to speak to a manager, completely forgetting where she was. The unimpressed guard simply blew her loud whistle. Two strong officers immediately stepped forward, grabbing Sienna by the arms to drag her toward solitary confinement for clear insubordination. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the crowded prison kitchen slowly dissolved. The miserable sounds of clanging iron pots and Sienna's fading, desperate screams melted into total, absolute silence. The grim gray reality of their well-deserved punishments washed away completely. The scene gently transitioned, replaced by the tranquil, bright, and wonderfully sunlit space of Cassidy's private art restoration studio. Here, far removed from the toxic chaos of her former marriage, she could finally breathe again. A new, magnificent chapter of her life was officially beginning right now. She picked up her paintbrush and smiled. The familiar scent of linseed oil and turpentine was gone completely, replaced by the crisp, energizing aroma of fresh espresso and newly printed legal documents. Her private art restoration sanctuary had been radically transformed. The heavy wooden easels and paint-covered canvas drops were cleared away, making room for sleek, minimalist glass desks and high-tech communication arrays. This sunlit haven was no longer just a quiet place to repair broken antique frames. It was officially the bustling, highly efficient headquarters for the brand new, globally recognized philanthropic wing of Vanguard Holdings. Cassidy stood at the center of the organized activity, watching her newly hired staff diligently processing applications. She felt a profound, surging sense of purpose. The crippling weight of Derek and his constant suffocating micromanagement was a distant memory. She was completely untethered, operating entirely on her own terms, fiercely directing her family and their vast resources toward a noble cause that resonated deep within her bones. The sleek frosted glass doors of the studio slid open with a soft hum. Her father, Jonathan Vanguard, stepped into the bright room. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his posture radiating immense pride. Right beside him walked lead Special Agent Kendra Vance, no longer wearing her severe tactical windbreaker. Today, Kendra wore a striking crimson blazer, looking every bit the triumphant architect of a major federal takedown. Jonathan held 2 chilled bottles of rare vintage champagne, while Kendra carefully carried a heavy stack of thick leather-bound folders. Cassidy wiped a stray smear of residual gold leaf from her thumb and walked over to greet them. Jonathan set the 2 heavy bottles down on the polished marble conference table. He popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack that echoed beautifully through the busy studio. The administrative staff looked up smiling warmly as the golden liquid cascaded rapidly into crystal flutes. Jonathan proudly handed a beautifully brimming glass directly to his smiling daughter. He raised his own glass high, his eyes crinkling with genuine affection. "To my brilliant daughter," Jonathan declared, his rich voice carrying clearly across the spacious room. "To reclaiming our legacy and to turning a dark chapter into a brilliant beacon of absolute light." Kendra raised her glass, next tapping it gently against Cassidy's flute. "To flawless execution, and to making absolutely sure parasites like Derek Sterling never ruin another life," the federal agent added with a sharp, knowing grin. Cassidy clinked her glass against theirs, savoring the crisp, expensive taste of total victory. She set the flute down carefully and turned her full attention to the leather folders Kendra had brought. She opened the top folder, smoothing her hand over the pristine legal parchment. This was the ultimate culmination of her meticulously plotted revenge. She slowly picked up a very heavy, solid silver fountain pen. With a few swift and elegant strokes, Cassidy officially authorized the launch of the Vanguard Empowerment Initiative. It was a massive $50 million legal and financial defense fund. This powerful war chest was entirely dedicated to helping vulnerable spouses escape abusive, deceitful, and financially controlling marriages forever. She was handing thousands of trapped women the exact same master key she had used to completely obliterate her own cruel warden. She quickly signed the very final page with a decisive, heavy flourish, capping the silver pen with a very satisfying click. The $50 million represented just a mere fraction of the massive funds she had successfully clawed back from Derek's hidden offshore accounts. It felt incredibly poetic to weaponize his stolen, embezzled cash to systematically destroy horrible men exactly like him. Kendra gathered the signed documents quickly, her stoic expression filled with profound professional respect. Jonathan placed a warm, reassuring hand firmly on Cassidy's shoulder, silently communicating a long lifetime of true fatherly pride. Cassidy took another sip of her champagne, letting the bright, effervescent bubbles ground her completely in the present moment. The chaotic noise of the past few weeks had fully evaporated, leaving behind a crystalline, unwavering clarity. She stepped away from the busy conference table, leaving her father and Kendra to finalize the complex administrative details with her newly appointed philanthropic directors. She walked very slowly across the polished hardwood floor, her high heels clicking rhythmically until she finally reached the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the far wall. The highly vibrant, sprawling skyline of downtown Chicago stretched out infinitely before her. The towering glass skyscrapers glinted brilliantly under the bright midday sun. Below her, millions of busy people were going about their daily lives, completely oblivious to the colossal power shift that had just occurred within the absolute upper echelons of their great city. She placed her open palm flat against the cool glass, feeling the subtle vibration of the bustling metropolis below. She had successfully survived a master manipulator, brilliantly outsmarted a federal criminal, and successfully orchestrated the most spectacular public downfall in recent corporate history. And she had done it all effortlessly, without ever raising her voice once. Cassidy turned her back to the breathtaking city view. She looked directly forward, her piercing gaze breaking the fourth wall, locking onto the audience with a grounded, terrifyingly calm intensity. The remaining ambient noise in the busy studio completely faded away, completely isolating her clear voice right in the absolute center of the camera frame. They call us weak when we choose peace. Cassidy stated, her tone perfectly, even completely devoid of any lingering anger or deep bitterness. They call us stupid when we choose to love without looking at a bank account. But never underestimate a woman who stays quiet. While they think we are suffering in silence, we are just measuring the dimensions of the cage we are about to lock them in. She raises her crystal flute one last time, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. She lowers the delicate glass, slowly smiling brightly, as the screen finally fades out to a very deep pitch black.